It turns out that there are a shocking number of rules and regulations concerning what parents can name their children when the naming has to happen by, and even a section of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child that specifically states that all people from birth have to have an inalienable right to have a name. This all brings us around to the topic of today, and that's what happens if parents flout that right and just don't name their baby. And further, what are some of the rules surrounding what names can be chosen in the first place? To begin with, let's start with the easiest, the United Kingdom. In this case, you have 42 days to name your baby, during which you can expect to occasionally be pestered by officials if you're taking your sweet time getting around to it. If you pass that time period, you will receive a £200 fine, and if you still refuse to give a name, a government official will name the child for you. That said, in some cases, UK officials may allow you to extend the period a bit beyond the 42 days, so long as you convince them that a resolution seems reasonably close at hand. You pay the fine and you keep them notified of the progress. Further, UK parents have up to a year after birth to submit a correction to a name should there be an error in official documentation, or if the parents just change their minds and want to rename the child. Beyond giving quite a lot of time for parents to pick a name, unlike a lot of countries on the other side of the pond, the UK is also pretty lax about what names you can pick, generally having few guidelines other than that it cannot contain obscenities, numbers be impossible to pronounce, and must not contain a title that could be misleading. Should you choose to flout these rules and try to name your child Sir Six Face Whistler, you can expect the registering officer to go ahead and reject all but the Whistler part of that name. In contrast, in countries like Norway and Denmark, you are required to pick from an approved list of names. In most countries that have such rules, including these two, you can attempt to deviate from the list if you go through the proper paperwork and approval first. Failure to get prior approval for an unlisted name will usually result in some sort of fine, and either the state rejecting the name submission outright, or if it slips through, the child's name may be forcibly changed later. For example, in one case in 1995, a Norwegian woman, Christy Larsen, attempted to name her 14th child Gersha, which is Hebrew for bridge. Christy claims that the name came to her in a dream. The state, however, didn't care about her nocturnal hallucinations and fined her the equivalent of $420, which is about $700 today. Unfortunately for her, when she refused to pay the fine, she was arrested and put in jail. She stated of this, "If we accept the fine, it's like we're admitting some kind of guilt." Which you were guilty of, Christy. She further brazenly stated, "No matter what the courts say, we're still calling Gersha Gersha." While not as strict as Norway, many other nations in Europe do similar things with varying guidelines generally centered around trying to ensure the child is not given an outlandish or offensive name. For example, in the early 2000s, a couple living in Germany attempted to name their child Osama bin Laden, a man they seemingly admired a great deal for whatever reason. This broke two naming rules in Germany. First, this name was likely to lead to humiliation for the child, and second, it was against the rules in the couple's home country of Turkey as well, which also made it against the German rules. Germany is also one of a surprising number of nations that require the child's name to indicate what gender they are. If it's unclear because it's a foreign name, generally the German officials will simply reach out to officials from other countries where the name is common, if any, for their input before approving or denying a name. Another example of this is France. While they have relaxed their rules significantly about the naming of children in recent years, you still cannot pick a name for a child which might be construed as the child being a different sex than their name is usually associated with, much to the chagrin of one French woman who tried to name her daughter Liam. Going back to what happens if parents don't name their child, Germany is also one of many countries where if you fail to choose a child's name after the allotted time period, in this case 4 weeks, an official will simply choose for you. In cases where the state picks, officials seemingly almost always just select one of the more popular names in a given country for a given sex of child, except in the United States, which as ever does things slightly differently. To begin with, there is basically no standardization from state to state within the US with regards to naming children, nor standard time period where this needs to occur. The few rules that do exist tend to be more practical in nature, for example, not allowing special characters simply because the state's database data type for the name field doesn't support them. There are also usually basic rules about how the last name should be chosen to facilitate dispute resolution should there be contention. For example, in Louisiana, if the mother was unmarried 300 days before the birth, so slightly before conception in the vast majority of cases, the mother's maiden name will get precedence in a dispute, whereas if she was married at the time, the father's, unless both parents agree to something different or there is otherwise no dispute. That said, as database systems are updated, rules sometimes change. For example, after a software update, Illinois began allowing numbers to be put in names, or even the name itself to be a number like 7, which is what at least one couple was found to choose as the middle name for their son, no doubt after watching Seinfeld. There are also states such as Alabama, Kentucky, Washington State, and Montana that don't even require the last name to match the parents at all, able to be pretty much anything you want within the bounds of the few other aforementioned rules about character restrictions. That said, a few states do include laws concerning use of offensive terms, such as California, who not only extend this to the naming of babies, but also to what you can change your own name to. For instance, in 1992, California courts barred a man from being able to change his own name to Mystery N-word. Moving on to what happens if the baby is not named after whatever period, usually in the ballpark of a week to a few weeks, with some buffer period after for changes without additional fees or hassle. It turns out there is no official standard here either. To start with, Michigan, Connecticut, and Nevada do not require a person to have a legal name at all, not even a last name, for their birth certificate to be processed. As far as we can find, this has never caused a significant issue anywhere, other than in one court case where a Connecticut judge needing to clarify the rules here was completely flummoxed when he tried to look into the matter, stating, "The court has inquired of dozens of Connecticut lawyers and judges, and no one has supplied even a portion of an answer to the question, how is a person's legal name established?" In general, what seems to happen in these cases is that if a parent forgoes naming their child within the allotted time before a birth certificate must be processed, no name is given and the parents are simply allowed to submit one later when they ultimately decide on one. That said, because of certain federal requirements, such as when trying to get a social security card, passport, etc., as well as when trying to register a child for school and things of that nature, for practical reasons, a name will inevitably be officially submitted at some point, which is perhaps why it's not ever really an issue, despite the lack of official state rules. Other states, like Ohio, simply require that, at minimum, a surname be given for the birth certificate to be processed, and then, in Ohio's case, they give you a year to decide on the full name. So what about the more general case in the United States, where a name is required to process a birth certificate and the parents do not want to give one? Well, the baby, in that case, will be given a name. However, unlike in many other nations, where this name would be something common within the nation, in the US the name given will almost always be something like baby boy, male, baby girl, female, or just baby, with an appropriate surname tacked on. In the case of twins, something like baby girl A and baby girl B, or baby 1 and baby 2 are also common. Very creative stuff. Exceptions do exist, though, for abandoned babies and the like, where occasionally officials will select a proper name for the child if a relative of the child can't be found and willing to take them in and name them. As to the more common case of indecisive parents, these baby boy-style names are a result of what hospital staff use as a placeholder in the hospital database until the parents give the baby a name. If the parents then fail to ever give an official moniker, the placeholder name inevitably gets used in the birth certificate processing, which is also typically handled by hospital staff. It should be noted here that studies have shown that this practice of hospitals basically giving the child the same first name if the parents haven't provided one absolutely increases the odds of issues for the baby while in the hospital, usually in the form of mix-ups with treatment and medication and things like that. For example, this could happen if there are two baby boy Smiths in the NICU at the same time. To help resolve this admittedly rare issue, some hospitals have switched to further tacking on the mother's name, so Jennifer's boy Smith instead of baby boy Smith. Of course, in more recent times, this is even less likely to occur anyway, thanks to commonly used wristbands with ID chips or barcodes to reduce the risk of screw-ups anywhere, though they still do happen. To further simplify things on their end, some hospital workers will also attempt to pressure the parents into giving the child child a name as quickly as possible, and even in some accounts we read actually tell the parents that it's required by law to give the baby a name before the baby is allowed to be taken home. However, despite what any hospital official may tell you, in the United States this is not required. Nor is it required that in home births the midwife or you give the baby a name right away. It's just simply required that you report the birth to the appropriate State Department. Now, while you might think that surely no parent would allow their child to be named something like baby boy, it does occasionally happen. Not always about not caring or inability to agree on a name, however, some parents feel the child themselves should pick their own name, and because it's a fairly straightforward and relatively inexpensive process in the US to change the name later, using the hospital's placeholder name for official documents at first isn't usually a big deal. Perhaps the most famous example of this is Olympic skier Peekaboo Street, whose name was originally Baby Girl. Peekaboo explains, "At first, my parents didn't have a name for me. My name on my birth certificate reads Baby Girl, and that's what they called me until I was almost 4. When they planned our first train trip to Mexico for vacation, we needed passports. My father liked the sound of peekaboo, an old Native American settlement an hour south. I also liked playing peekaboo with him. My mother and father agreed on peekaboo. If you're wondering, supposedly peekaboo meant silver water." In any event, many countries likewise make it no big hurdle to change a child's name, usually just a bit of paperwork and a fee, so long as both parents agree, or if one parent isn't in the picture, that this can be conclusively demonstrated first. That said, delaying doing so in the US does potentially open things up to a judge's discretion on what might be acceptable, whereas naming from birth in the US usually has few, if any, restrictions other than on the character set. Finally, we should probably mention that in 46 of the 50 states in the US, should you name your child something silly like Tallulah does the hula from Hawaii, more on this in a bit in the bonus facts section, but everyone calls you Kay and you yourself accept that as a name, that is now legally your name if you want it to be. However, for certain official documents at the federal level, like passports, you still may need to get the courts to give you official documentation of the change. But outside of this, you are allowed to use your chosen name as your official legal name, even if it doesn't match what's on your birth certificate and you never went through any official process to get it changed. We're guessing that little Adolf Hitler, yes, another one we're going to be talking about in the bonus facts section, is pretty thankful for that one, regardless of what his parents' political views are. And now for some bonus facts. In countries with few regulations on what a parent can name their children, like the US and the UK, relative ease of changing a name is probably a good thing. For example, consider the case of Heath Campbell, who has a whopping 9 children by 5 different women. The New Jersey man has named every one of his kids with a Nazi theme. For example, little Adolf Hitler Campbell, Joycelyn Aryan Nation Campbell, and Eva Braun Campbell. Apparently, for reasons completely unrelated to the names, the state has taken custody of every single one of Heath's kids. For example, in the case of Eva Braun Campbell, this occurred when the couple attempted to check out of the hospital. Said his then-fiancée Bethany Zito, when the Franklin County Children and Youth Service informed her they were taking the baby, "I started screaming, I got hysterical, I had just been checked out. I was breastfeeding my daughter for 2 days straight. I changed her, I had clothes on her." Heath himself stated of this, "I'm not allowed to have children because I'm a Nazi. Jewish people came, they took my kids, all over a name. I didn't murder anybody, I didn't hurt anybody. What crime did I do? Yes, I'm guilty of loving my children. Society thinks the Germans and the Nazis are bad people, when really we're not. We're family-oriented." You're also a Nazi, Heath. For f***'s sake. The state, on the other hand, says that neither the names nor his political leanings have anything to do with their decision to take the children. They probably should, but rather the lengthy history of violence and abuse in the household, which was first discovered when Heath attempted to have a birthday cake made with "Happy Birthday Adolf Hitler" when his son was turning 6. Officials then investigated the household, with the result being a couple of his former wives stating that Heath both frequently beat them and variously threatened to murder them, among other various red flags that authorities found. Perhaps not doing himself any favors, in one custody dispute case in which he was attempting to get custody of his 18-month-old son, Heinrich Hans Campbell, who was taken shortly after being born in 2011, while Heath did technically dress up for the hearing, it wasn't in a way that exactly endeared him to the authorities. Rather than wearing something like a suit and tie, he showed up dressed in a full Nazi military dress uniform, as well as sporting a Hitler-inspired mustache. What's wrong with you, Heath? You His prominent tattoo that says "Kill Judes" probably didn't help either. And yes, for those German speakers out there, it did indeed say Judes instead of Juden. Moving on to something much more silly, but nonetheless still not appreciated by the child in question. In New Zealand, parents named their daughter Tallulah Does the Hula from Hawaii. When the girl was 9, the matter was brought to the attention of the courts during a custody dispute. Up to this point, the girl had simply told everyone at school her name was Kay, and that she was extremely embarrassed by her name. The judge in the case, Rob Murfitt, ordered the state to temporarily take custody of the child, during which time the name was changed to something not publicly disclosed. Said Judge Murfitt, "The court is profoundly concerned about the very poor judgment that this child's parents have shown in choosing this name. It makes a fool of the child and sets her up with a social disability and handicap unnecessarily." On the whole, even some of the largest and most successful companies in the world eventually fail, with companies offering their services to make you a popsicle after your body decides to say "screw you" in particular, being no exception. So what happens to the approximately 350 people, and rising fast, who are stored this way when a cryonic company goes the way of their customers? Is it really only 350 people? I thought it'd be way higher. There's got to be tons of rich people who want to be frozen. Well, for starters, it turns out that thanks to the fact that every single one of the earliest cryonic companies went belly up, the latest generation of cryonics companies have put in place some nearly surefire ways to keep that from ever happening to them, outside of, stuff like a World War III nuclear holocaust or stuff like that. But as to the early cryonics companies, these were first started in the 1960s and initially just advertised as freezing bodies for cosmetic reasons, rather than the literal hope of reanimation. It's like, great, so my family can look at my dead body? And in fact, early efforts here didn't even bother to try and stop damage to tissues from ice formation in the freezing process. They simply froze the bodies directly. Patient Zero, the first guy frozen using a method meant to preserve him in the hope of future reanimation, however, had a basic cocktail of preservatives and chemicals meant to stop such ice crystal formation, with this man being former psychology professor Dr. James Bedford, who died of cancer in 1967. As to what happens with these early companies, the big issue, beyond equipment failures and faulty procedures resulting in accidental thawing, was that they relied on friends and family of the deceased to make regular payments to keep the bodies nice and frozen. Should the deceased's loved ones just decide that they didn't want to pay these anymore, which almost universally happens after their death, their mostly dead loved ones would be allowed to, thaw out and complete the dying process. Although, interestingly, in at least one company's case, they were found in 1979 to have thawed, some intentionally, others accidentally, 17 of the 18 bodies that they were storing without notifying anyone. Naturally, lawsuits ensued, but big surprise, the company was bankrupt. In other cases, once the bodies were accidentally thawed or the payments had just stopped, the companies simply notified the deceased next of kin and popped the body in the post. Not really, I'm assuming there was some sort of collection process. That said, the one and only patient to survive these early efforts, funnily enough, was Patient Zero, James Bedford. His still frozen body was transferred to his son when the company storing him went under. His son then dutifully took steps to keep Bedford frozen for many years before handing the body over to Alcor, a more modern cryonics company. Noteworthy here was that when his body was transferred to their facility, Alcor representatives noted upon inspecting Bedford that his body was actually in excellent condition, at least externally. So moving on to those more modern companies, should they fail, as they are technically not guaranteeing to eventually see the bodies stored at their facilities reanimated, presumably the same thing that happened with the first generation batch of companies will happen. The bodies will be transferred over to the relatives of the deceased for them to do whatever they please with. That said, learning from the failures of their predecessors, as alluded to, these companies are generally set up a little bit differently in terms of ensuring their long-term viability. Apparently, no one can trust their family to keep paying to keep them frozen. On top of that, the two biggest companies are set up as non-profits as well. As for how they keep themselves funded, first, rather than relying on loved ones, payments, usually via a life insurance policy or portion of one's estate, must be bequeathed to them, unless of course you die in such a way that they can't preserve you or they can't do it fast enough. I'm imagining some sort of horrific car crash. The cost of such storage ranges from about $28,000 to $200,000 depending on the package chosen and the company, with the only companies in existence doing this being the United States and Russia. And I believe they're at the lower end of the spectrum, I'm not sure, but I think it's just because they're freezing your brain. They take your brain out and just freeze that. I might have looked into this at one point. Beyond that, they require a sort of annual fee before you die. For example, Alcor requires $700 per year, and the Cryonics Institute requires $120 annually, or a one-time payment of $1,250. For reference here, it only costs about $150 to $800 per year to maintain a body and the facilities for it. Thus, at least strictly when talking facilities and storage, so long as the companies have more people alive waiting to be frozen than are currently stored, there will always be at least a base level of money needed to maintain the facilities, which don't really require many people to keep going at all. Also, for reference, Alcor reports over 1,200 people on the waiting list to be stored, versus only a little over 170 currently stored, and CI has over 2,000 on their waiting list versus about 160 currently stored. These numbers are also rising dramatically every year from the year before. While those annual fees do provide some steady cash flow for the companies, the more viable long-term plan comes in the form of a trust that, for example, Alcor requires be set up, with, in their case, the amount per person ranging from $25,000 to $110,000 depending on the storage type. This is included as a part of the aforementioned cost of being stored. Currently, Alcor's public filings show that they have a bit over $10 million in their trust fund. As to why this can potentially be a bulletproof plan, Ben Franklin aptly demonstrated this when he left £1,000 to each of the cities of Philadelphia and Boston, £146,000 or $167,000 today when adjusting for inflation. The catch was that they couldn't have the money until 100 years after his death, with the money to be held in a trust. Further, after that 100 years, the cities could only take a portion of it out and had to leave the rest for another 100 years. And look, if you've got any idea how compound interest works, this is going to be pretty great. But how did it actually work out? After one civil war, several major stock market crashes, a slew of pandemics, and 2 world wars, among others, in 1990, when Philadelphia cashed out their second installment, it was worth a whopping $2 million. That's £1.7 million. Boston, on the other hand, which had opted to leave more of a fund in after the first withdrawal, had about $5 million, £4.4 million at their disposal that year. The power of compound interest, even when there's wars and catastrophes and stuff like that, is still pretty incredible, don't forget it. Okay, so let's go back to the cryonics companies. To further make sure that the investment boards are wisely investing these trusts, it is required, for example at Alcor, that a large percentage of the board have loved ones currently at the facility awaiting medical science to go full Star Trek The Next Generation, the neutral zone on them, and or themselves be slated to be frozen when their bodies cease to keep on keeping on. Interestingly, if a person is eventually revived, the remainder of their percentage of the trust at that point will apparently be transferred back to the person to help them get started in the no doubt strange new world that they find themselves in. And that just really makes me think that if I was going to get frozen, I would put a lot of money in their trust so that when I woke up, I'd be extremely rich. Of course, this could potentially be catastrophic for the companies if everyone is revived at once, but given at that time, as reanimation would now be by definition fully possible, the viability of the company after this, one way or another, isn't really a concern. This all brings us to the likelihood of reanimation, given modern methods. To begin with, this in part depends on how quickly you can be frozen. To help ensure things are handled in a timely manner, beyond approximate known death times, as in the case of late-stage cancer patients, making sure representatives from the companies are on hand to do their thing as soon as legally allowed, usually a couple of minutes after death is declared. The companies also give out bracelets and necklaces for subscribers to wear so that those who find their body know immediately to contact the cryonic company. They also advise you to tell your loved ones your wishes, although given the amount of money being transferred to these companies upon death, let's just say living relatives don't exactly always have the best track record of making sure that these companies are notified quickly in some cases. People's families suck. It's like, yeah, no, we let the body go a bit funky and I guess he can't be frozen now, so we'll take all the money. From there, the modern methods of freezing and proprietary cocktails of chemicals have improved markedly from the early efforts. For example, in 2016, researchers at 21st Century Medicine managed to successfully use a cocktail of vitrification solution of their own making to lower the temperature of a rabbit and a pig brain to minus 135 degrees Celsius, that's minus 211 degrees Fahrenheit. They then later slowly warmed the brains back up, flushed the chemicals out, and analyzed them for damage. The results? Well, they'd successfully kept the cell membranes, intracellular structures, and synapses seemingly intact. To quote the paper on the subject, preservation was uniformly excellent. Processes were easily traceable, and synapses were crisp in both species. That's incredible. All that said, given the toxicity level of the cocktails being used here and dehydration damage to cells and the like during the processes involved, many medical professionals think even if the tissues and neurons are all extremely well preserved overall, the damage from all of this is enough that even if the chemicals are all flushed out upon revival and blood being reintroduced, this will still result in the impossibility of full reanimation of the tissues. Excellent condition is of course not perfect condition, oh dear. That said, even if the tissue itself can't be reanimated, some speculate it's always possible if well preserved enough. Technology may either be able to repair the damage or someday allow for mapping the neurons and connections and the like, and then transferring that to a computer system, allowing your consciousness of a sort, or at least the memories, to potentially live on in a cybernetic form. So essentially we're talking about putting your brain in a robot. That is epic. Further advancements in cryonic technology are also looked at in the form of not necessarily freezing people at all, instead simply removing the brain and keeping it alive in an unconscious state. That sounds horrific. While that may sound like complete science fiction, it turns out that researchers at Yale have already managed it, albeit only for a short time. In this case, they took over 100 pig brains and hooked them up to a system of pumps that circulated warmed artificial blood to provide oxygen and nutrients. With their method, they were able to successfully keep the brains alive and functioning normally for 36 hours. At the end, the brains were analyzed and found to be, by all appearances, in great condition. Now look, I'm not a member of PETA or anything, but that sounds pretty horrific. Those brains were probably conscious. If one could eventually advance that technology for indefinite storage, there's potential to keep the brain alive and perfectly functional until head transplant technology is perfected. And while that also seems like something needing many decades of advancements, it turns out that that too actually isn't as futuristic as you might think. For example, one Dr. Ren Xiaoping and his team in China have successfully transplanted literal heads of hundreds of rats and other animals onto new host bodies, including transplanting monkey heads. For the curious, Dr. Xiaoping reports that a monkey head transplant takes approximately 20 hours to complete, and he expects a human head transplant to take an additional 10 to 20 hours on top of that once they reach a suitable success rate on monkeys, which are very similar to humans, of course. Should these two methods of keeping a brain alive outside a body and eventual transplant be perfected, people using this method of preservation may have a much sooner fix than reviving cryonically frozen individual. Although one can only imagine the living nightmare if the brain remains conscious during such a stasis, no longer being hooked up to any sensory inputs or means of output at all, and simply existing for years in that state. Needless to say, should that occur, one would assume nearly everyone would have gone fully mad by the time of any revival in a new body. Although it should be noted here that researchers in the pig brain study note, given the brain activity at the time, they are reasonably sure the pig brains weren't conscious, for whatever that's worth. I think it's worth a lot, actually. All this said, seemingly everyone, including the cryonics companies themselves, concede the likelihood of eventual reanimation is low, with the mantra within the industry that being cryonically frozen is the second worst thing that can happen to you. But given the odds of reanimation are definitely zero if you're buried or cremated, and given that you can't take your money with you after you're gone, more and more people are taking a flyer on this particular lottery ticket. This is especially true as all it takes to enter the game is having a reasonable estate upon your death or a decent life insurance policy. Although if you are ever revived, that begs the question, would you have to pay back that life insurance policy? If you're wondering, we have a likely answer to this question in our video. Do you get your stuff back if you go missing or are declared dead, then turn up alive like a certain Shire Hobbit? That video is going to be linked to below. But in the end, should the cryonics process fail, which is probably likely, well, you were dead anyway, so, may as well. But then again, if it succeeds, well, you get to find yourself far in the future with wonderful technology and everyone you know and loved having long ago died. And there's probably robot overlords who make you a slave. Yay! Given we know that even Neanderthals would bury their dead, even including objects with the bodies, and various human hunter-gatherer groups likewise used to bury or cremate people at specific sites that functioned as sort of pilgrimage locations for these nomads, it should come as no surprise that since the dawn of known warfare, soldiers have pondered the question of what to do with the bodies of their fallen comrades and enemies. So what did various groups throughout history actually do about this? A thing we should note before we continue is that there is a definite gap in the memory of history in regards to this one specific matter, and historians only have sparse reports of what happened to the dead of many groups after battles. You might think that solving this problem would simply be a matter of locating famous battle sites and doing some digging to glean a little more insight, but it turns out even this is notoriously difficult, as we're going to get into shortly. That caveat out of the way, on the more definitive front, it's noted that the ancient Greeks made an effort to respect the usual burial customs of the dead after a battle, and collecting the bodies of the fallen was not uncommon. For example, following the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC between Philip II of Macedonia and the Athenians, both sides buried their dead in accordance with the religious customs of the period. This was essentially done both out of respect for the valor of the dead, as well as to appease the gods. With the exception of the Spartans, most ancient Greek societies also made efforts to bury their dead near the city that they hailed from, if time allowed for it. For the sake of practicality, though, mass graves or the like were sometimes utilized instead. In this case, cenotaphs were sometimes erected near their home city in honor of the fallen. As noted, an exception to this are the Spartans, who often buried fallen soldiers on the battlefield where they were killed. Also somewhat unique was that rather than stripping the dead of valuables, as per Spartan tradition, each fallen Spartan was buried with their weapons and armor, and their final resting place was marked by a simple tombstone with their name and an inscription that read, translated, "In war." This was actually a special honor among the Spartans. If one were to die outside of a battle, no such tombstone would be given, and the person would simply be buried in an unmarked grave. The one exception to that was if a woman died in childbirth, then she too would be given the honor of a tombstone. As for the Romans, most soldiers paid a small stipend each month to pay for funeral expenses should they fall in battle. As you might expect from this, the Romans made a conscious effort to recover the bodies of those who died, and if time allowed it, they would bury or cremate them individually. If this wasn't possible, the bodies of soldiers killed in battle would be collected and given a mass cremation or burial. In the event the bodies couldn't be recovered, a cenotaph would be erected to serve as a monument to the individual. The same cannot be said of later wars, where there seems to have been an almost callous disregard for the fallen, and looting of the dead and dying was commonplace. For example, the Bear Tapestry depicting the Battle of Hastings in 1066 shows soldiers piling up bodies of the dead and stripping them of their valuables. It is believed that following this, bodies were quickly cremated or buried in nearby mass graves. It should be noted here, however, that with the rise of Christianity, mass cremation, at least for a time, seems to have gone the way of the dodo in some regions in favor of mass graves. That said, despite the countless battles that occurred throughout medieval Europe, archaeologists have had an extraordinarily difficult time actually finding any of the bodies. As one paper published in the Journal of Conflict Archaeology, aptly titled "Where Are the Dead of Medieval Battles?" notes, only a handful of mass graves from the late medieval battles in Western Europe have been subject to large-scale excavation to modern standards. The principal reason is that these, and indeed even early modern battlefield graves, have proven extremely elusive, most being identified by chance. Despite a few successes, no combination of prospecting techniques yet provides a consistently effective method of locating such small archaeological features set almost anywhere within a site covering many square kilometers. Looking at much better documented times, looting of the dead was also extraordinarily common during the extremely deadly Napoleonic Wars, with soldiers and locals alike pilfering what they could find after battles. For example, consider this account from a British general following the Battle of Heilsberg in 1807. The grounds between the wood and the Russian batteries, about a quarter of a mile, was a sheet of naked human bodies, which friends and foes had, during the night, mutually stripped, although numbers of these bodies still retained consciousness of their situation. It was a sight that the eye loathed, but from which it could not remove. And yes, as noted there, the severely wounded weren't spared the indignity of being robbed of their worldly possessions as they lay dying. And worst of all, this was done not just by their enemies, but by their comrades as well. In fact, there are first-hand accounts from wounded soldiers who went on to survive their injuries, detailing the shock of waking up completely naked. Here's a snippet of one such quote from a French soldier called Jean-Baptiste de Marbeau. "Stretched on the snow among the piles of dead and dying, unable to move in any way, I gradually and without pain lost consciousness. I judged that my swoon lasted 4 hours, and when I came to my sense, I found myself in this horrible position. I was completely naked, having nothing on but my hat and my right boot. A man of the Transport Corps, thinking me dead, had stripped me in the unusual fashion, and wishing to pull off the only boot that remained, was dragging me by one leg with his foot against my body. The jerk which the man gave me no doubt had restored me to my senses. I succeeded in sitting up and spitting out the clots of blood from my throat, The shock caused by the wind of the ball had produced such an extravasation of blood that my face, shoulders, and chest were black, while the rest of my body was stained red by the blood from my wound. My hat and my hair were full of blood-stained snow, and as I rolled my haggard eyes, I must have been horrible to see. Anyhow, the transport man looked the other way and went off with my property without my being able to say a single word to him, so utterly prostrate was I. After being stripped of their belongings, the dead, and occasionally still barely living, would often be buried in mass graves, sometimes with bodies from both sides unceremoniously being thrown in. In general, this was either accomplished via the soldiers themselves doing it, or in many cases, members of the local populace being given the gruesome task. However, there are accounts of battles where thousands of bodies were simply left to the elements. For example, General Philippe Ségur states in 1812, "After passing the Kaloga, we marched on, absorbed in thought, when some of us, raising our eyes, uttered a cry of horror. Each one instantly looked about him, and there lay stretched before us a plain trampled, bare, and devastated, all the trees cut down within a few feet of the surface, and farther off craggy hills, the highest of which appeared misshapen and bore a striking resemblance to an extinguished volcano. The ground around us was everywhere covered with fragments of helmets and cuirasses, with broken drums, gun stocks, tatters of uniforms, and standards dyed with blood. On that desolate spot lay 30,000 half-devoured corpses." It should also be noted here that beyond any possessions the bodies may have had on them before being stripped, the bodies themselves were also of value. For example, human scavengers would come through and rob the dead of their teeth, which would then be used to make dentures. The Napoleonic Wars and the Battle of Waterloo in particular were such a boon for the British dental industry in this way that dentures for a time were known as Waterloo teeth in the UK. Teeth from soldiers were highly sought after, owing to predominantly coming from relatively young men who still had reasonably good teeth. In one account, one Astley Cooper met such a tooth hunter and noted, "Upon asking this butler, who appeared to be in a state of great destitution, what might be his object, he said it was to get teeth. But when I came to question him upon the means by which he was to obtain these teeth, he said, 'Oh, sir, only let there be a battle, and there'll be no want of teeth. I'll draw them as fast as the men are knocked down.'" Even more grimly, the bones of the dead of some of these battles were later collected and pulverized into fertilizer, which was sold for a modest price across Europe. To quote an article from The Observer written in 1822, "It is now ascertained beyond a doubt by actual experiment on an extensive scale that a dead soldier is a most valuable article of commerce, and for aught be known to the contrary, the good farmers of Yorkshire are, in a great measure, indebted to the bones of their children for their daily bread. It is certainly a singular fact that Great Britain should have sent out such multitudes of soldiers to fight the battles of this country upon the continent of Europe, and should then import their bones as an article of commerce to fatten her soil." The remains of soldiers were also sometimes collected for use in souvenirs of major battles. For example, poet Eaton Stannard Barrett wrote, "I know one honest gentleman who brought home a real Waterloo thumb, nail and all, which he preserves in a bottle of gin." Moving across the pond into slightly more recent history, markedly more respect was shown for the dead during the American Civil War, where teams of soldiers were tasked with burying the dead of both sides in simple mass graves, with great care being taken to ensure most soldiers received a proper burial. Finally, to discuss World War I and World War II, individual units were largely responsible for the disposal of their own dead, with both Axis and Allied forces having their own rules for how this should be handled. For example, during World War II, Colonel Walter Sonntag of the Wehrmacht's Casualty Office issued a comprehensive guide for how military mass graves should be constructed. Amongst other things, the guidelines indicated that mass graves should be made as close to railway lines as possible and to feature pathways, with the intention being that they'd eventually be turned into war cemeteries. As the war raged on, these guidelines were largely ignored for the sake of practicality. As for the Allies during World War II, burying the dead largely fell to individual soldiers, but some units dedicated to the task did exist. For example, the United States' Quartermaster Graves Registration Service. Tasked with finding and burying every fallen American soldier, the Quartermaster Graves Registration Service have been hailed as some of the unsung heroes of the war due to the general lack of recognition they've received since it ended. Graves registration units were exceptionally committed to their task and undertook their duties with a solemn sense of duty and determination, going to extraordinary lengths to identify bodies and perform the appropriate burial rites depending on the fallen soldier's religious affiliation. When appropriate, GRS units would bury civilian, Allied, and Axis casualties they came across, making sure to bury them in well-marked graves. The location of these graves was then passed on to the relevant authorities. Prison by design is a place where a number of your rights are either stripped away or are severely limited in some manner. The right most pertinent to the topic of conversation today is the ability to freely access your bank account and or manage any money or assets that you have. First though, we should probably mention the distinction between jail and prison, as the terms are often erroneously used interchangeably. In a nutshell, jails generally serve to hold individuals who are awaiting a trial, and in the US they're typically run by county officers, whereas prisons hold those who've been sentenced, and they usually are run by prisons and correction officers in each state. As with all things in life, there are exceptions here. An individual sentenced to shorter sentences, usually less than a year, can be incarcerated in jails. Moving on, in the United States, with the exception of a few specific types of crime that we're going to discuss in more detail in a moment, upon being sentenced, absolutely nothing whatsoever will happen to your money, your property, or your assets. In fact, an often unforeseen downside of being arrested and being sent to prison is that you're still on the hook for all of the financial obligations that you're committed to prior to being arrested and sentenced, and that includes things like rent, bills, and of course any debt. But of course at this point you'll likely have lost any way to make any significant amount of money in order to pay the bills. So if you head to prison with a phone contract or even something like a Netflix subscription, that money will continue to be vacuumed out of your account each and every month. For this reason and others, many lawyers strongly advise getting your financial life, including settling any debts and getting rid of any bills you can, in order before any kind of potential prison sentence, to avoid an unnecessary loss of funds or leaving prison in a worse financial situation than when you entered it, which is extremely common. This can be difficult, however, for those who are suddenly arrested and unable to post bail in order to potentially have an interim period between jail and prison to get everything in order. Then again, depending on the amount of time that you're sentenced to serve, having something like a Netflix account or similar subscription that takes a very small amount of money from your account each month can actually be quite a good idea. The reason being that it is the policy of most banks to freeze accounts if no activity is recorded on it for a set amount of time. This varies from bank to bank, but around 6 to 12 months of inactivity seems to be a good ballpark figure for when this generally occurs. Further, if your account has been frozen for more than 15 years, at least in the UK, the government is allowed to take any money in such an account and distribute it to worthy causes, though technically you're still supposed to be able to recover the money even then if you happen to be able to track it down after all that time. On that note, if your account is frozen, a bank should have no problem unfreezing it, provided you can jump through the required hoops. The problem, of course, being that unfreezing an account from within prison is, from a practical standpoint, sometimes an effort in futility, with the best case scenario being that you'll be able to get the account unfrozen after many months of effort and help from someone on the outside. Thus, lawyers generally advise making nominal payments into or from an account while in prison to avoid this from happening. A problem here, of course, is that while in prison, in many regions of the world, you are forbidden or severely restricted to any direct access to any bank accounts that you have. This might all have you wondering, well, how do you make any payments or deposits from prison? Well, in the UK, prisoners are allowed to make limited banking transactions of a personal nature, provided they are to either help you maintain your personal affairs whilst in prison, or to help assist you to resume a regular lifestyle on release. For example, a British prisoner can issue checks, pay debts, and even authorize the sale of property or assets within reason, or even run a legitimate business in a limited capacity. However, there are often severe restrictions to access to telephone and internet banking, if access is given at all, meaning that for most inmates, banking has to be done by mail. It should also be noted here that access to mail and what correspondence are allowed in and out for a given inmate can often be severely restricted as well. In addition, most prisoners on both sides of the pond usually have access to special prison accounts which are usable within prison. This account can be used to buy things from the commissary like toiletries, or even personal items like TVs or radios. This is all at the discretion of prison officials. In fact, if you ever do find yourself in prison in the United States and you want to watch a Today I Found Out video, you absolutely can, although it's at an exorbitant price that we have nothing to do with. Honestly, if it was up to us, we'd just give them away for free, and if you're in prison watching this, I'm very sorry that it's so damn expensive. Nonetheless, some inmates do choose to pay that exorbitant fee to watch our videos. To date, the most popular such video seems to be the video on the colourful life of Colonel Sanders, which, by the way, we go into a lot more detail about on our Brain Food Show podcast in the episode titled A Restaurant for a Beetle and $100 in a Bike, the fascinating stories behind 4 famous businesses. so go check that out. And that's not even to mention how prohibitively expensive it is to use a phone to call your kids and other family or correspond with a bank or a debt collector from prison. On top of the cost, there's also the extremely limited time that inmates are allowed to talk on the phone per day to anyone, even if they do have the money. Usually it's about 10 minutes, and that's not even going to get you past that automated phone system, is it? And this is all despite the fact that it has been conclusively proven that increased family communication while in prison markedly reduces the rate of recidivism among inmates. The prison system at work, everybody. As US Senator Brian Schatz recently noted, people in prison should not have to pay exorbitant fees just to talk on the phone with their kids, their clergy, or their counsel. It's bad for human rights, it's bad for our justice system, and it's bad for our taxpayers. Hear, hear, Brian. Moving swiftly on, one key difference between the way the American system works compared to the system in the UK is that bank accounts cannot be used directly by inmates to conduct personal banking transactions in the US. In contrast, in the UK, they can, and an individual can, transfer money from the prison account to a personal account, or even to another person's account entirely to pay debts and the like. Again, this is not an option directly available to prisoners in the US. As Ed Rosser, spokesman for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, has noted, inmates can protect legitimate business interests by executing powers of attorney. We allow that to happen, but we do not facilitate inmates paying their bills. This all has to be scheduled from the outside. Any financial responsibility you have on the outside unrelated to your court orders, you're on your own. On this note, as one former inmate, Preston Love Jr., stated, "Before I went to jail, I had a car, cell phone, cable, and internet, credit cards, and many other bills and loans that were being paid. I contacted a few of the companies, but many of them said there wasn't anything they could do until I was in jail. Once I was in jail, there was still nothing they could do. I had people try to call and make arrangements for me, but they wouldn't allow them." Because of all of this, it's strongly recommended that before sentencing, you give someone on the outside official, full access to all of your finances and accounts. You could do this with something like a blanket power of attorney, or even something as simple as a joint bank account. Again, this must be done before you're incarcerated because, as lawyer David O'Neill has stated, inmates can't set up bank accounts. We've called numerous banks, but they all tell us the same thing. You have to be physically present to set up bank accounts. Of course, while it's possible to give someone else control of your financial assets, such as a loved one, a lawyer, or a financial expert, there are pros and cons in each option. For example, transferring control of your financial assets to a loved one usually intentionally leaves them the ability to do pretty much whatever they want with your assets. This can be a good or bad thing depending on the person. To quote financial advisor Andrew Bernstein, "I tell people going in to get a reliable person, somebody that you trust your life with, and make them a power of attorney for your bills, for your home. Essentially, you're turning everything over to somebody else. It's got to be someone that's not going to screw you over." Of course, it's possible to limit this person's access to your money, but this may be a problem if they're only able to withdraw money and there's not enough money in the bank account and you can't add more. Given how powerless inmates are to do anything about it, things like identity theft and the trusted person running off with all the money is not terribly uncommon. Thus, for those who can afford it, it's often advisable to entrust a lawyer or a professional financial manager to handle things if you can. And if you're wondering, none of what we've discussed changes if you're sentenced to life in prison, and a person on the receiving end of such a sentence is still required to settle any and all debts. Then again, the data pretty clearly shows that one's credit score and paying one's debts is pretty low on the priority list of people who really think they're never going to be released from prison. However, occasionally people are paroled from even life sentences, so most lawyers strongly advise even those people to do their best to settle their financial obligations so that if they ever do get out, they're not going to get in trouble immediately. And just to quickly say that if someone does die in prison, it's pretty much the same situation as if they died outside of prison. Their remaining assets, if there are any, will be divided up in accordance with their will and debt obligations. The exception to all of this, though, is that if the authorities believe a person has benefited financially in some way from the crimes that they are accused of, in which case many governments, including the US and the UK, have broad authority to seize and distribute assets as they see fit. In the UK, for example, the 2002 Proceeds of Crime Act allows the authorities to distribute seized money and assets to charities. They can also use them to fund community projects in an area affected by crime, or even give the money directly to victims of a crime as a form of compensation. For the most part, though, assets are sold and the money is given to the government coffers for the purpose of fighting crime. This is essentially what happens in the US as well, with assets being sold at police auctions and things like that, with the money going back to the authorities in some cases, or also going to the state or the federal government. If the extent to which a person benefited financially from their crimes cannot be ascertained in both the US and the UK, the authorities will attempt to freeze their bank accounts, essentially preventing them from being used in any manner previously described while everything's being sorted out. The idea here is to prevent the individual from, say, sending the money abroad so the government can no longer easily seize it or something like that. If it's all sorted out and it's found that there's been no wrongdoing, the owner can then access the money again in the same limited way that a prisoner could access their normal accounts. Further, if you find yourself in prison and some debt collectors come a-calling, it's also possible that they'll be able to petition to have the money directly taken from your account without consent. For some inmates who might have no good way to settle a debt otherwise, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. But in a nutshell, if one is sentenced to life in prison or just a month, a person, depending on where they are in the world, usually has extremely limited access to their various assets behind bars, despite still being obligated to pay any bills and debts as if they were still gainfully employed and a free individual. So it's standard procedure in most hospitals to incinerate any limbs, organs, or tissue that they remove from a non-organ donor patient. However, just because this is the way things are normally done, it's not necessarily the way it has to be done. For example, while there almost universally doesn't seem to be any law saying you have rights to an amputated limb after a doctor removes it, in many cases you can ask for anything cut off or removed from your body back from the hospital, and they'll usually say yes if pressed on the matter. Even where laws exist, they tend to be less about how to handle such tissue and more about getting around potential lawsuits. For example, in California, there is a law stating that patients cannot sue after the fact for the return of tissue used in medical research or for a share of the profits if the tissue removed leads to a medical breakthrough. We're actually going to touch more on this a little bit later in the bonus fact section, so do stay tuned. That said, prior to any surgery, hospital representatives will invariably ask patients to sign a form that cedes ownership of their surgical leavings. They are usually left to the pathology lab for use in medical research or study. However, as a patient, you are entirely within your rights to not sign such a form and request ownership of any piece of your body removed during surgery. But as previously alluded to, hospitals and doctors won't always make this easy for you and will often tell you that it isn't possible owing to removed bits being a bit of a biohazard. While this sounds like a totally reasonable explanation, in truth this is usually just something hospital representatives say when a hospital has a policy against returning removed bits, generally from wanting to avoid jumping through the additional effort involved in returning a body part. As lawyer and author of The Law of Human Remains, Tanya Mash notes, when they don't want to do something, they'll tell people it's illegal. That doesn't mean it's illegal. A lot of people just cave when they're told it's not permitted. Or as PBS succinctly states, unless a piece of removed tissue contains a communicable disease or virus, keeping your own body parts isn't inherently any more dangerous than keeping a steak. And even if you have a communicable disease, the common practice of preserving the tissue or limb submersed in a solution of water and formaldehyde will usually kill off any such diseases. This makes the often claimed biohazard excuse for not returning your body part generally pretty bogus. For example, you can consider the case of Christy Loyal, who, upon being told she needed to have her foot amputated owing to cancer, she asked the hospital for it back, only to be stonewalled by doctors who told her that this wasn't possible. Nevertheless, she insisted, and after hounding the hospital about the issue for several weeks, they agreed to return it. It's also noteworthy here that while they initially said it wasn't possible, the hospital actually had a liability release form on file specifically for use when returning removed body parts. After signing the form and getting her foot and part of her leg back, Loyal paid $650 to a private company to skeletonize it. Hilariously, she actually maintains an Instagram account called One Foot Wanderer, where she takes various photos with said foot, such as this glorious shot of her using her skeletonized foot as a golf club. When asked if she had any advice for people who similarly wanted to keep an amputated limb, Loyal explained that it was important to just be persistent and keep reminding everyone that you are getting it back. As for exactly what condition you'll get your limb, organ, or tissue back in, this will usually depend on the tests the pathologist conducts on it and the manner in which it is removed. Things like kidney stones, for example, will normally be destroyed by the tests performed on them after the fact, if not the method used to remove them in the first place. Because of this, while you can theoretically ask for anything removed from your body back, occasionally this really won't be possible. But where possible, and if you do insist, the general process is that the organ, tissue, or limb will be sent off to a pathology lab. Among other things, this will be to ensure that it's kept pathogen-free. It will also be preserved in some way, usually, as mentioned, in a solution including formaldehyde. You will also have to sign a liability release form before it will be returned to you. Once back in your possession in most regions, you're free to do with it as you please. One man, Leo Bonton, even created a rather fetching, if a little creepy, lamp out of his leg. As for what happens if you're interested in selling your former body part, with a few exceptions, this is largely entirely within your rights, as there aren't really very much in the way of regulations in the United States and many other countries about the ownership or sale of human remains. The exception to this in the United States is primarily regarding the sale or ownership of Native American remains, which are protected by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Do take note, though, that if you live in the states of Louisiana, Georgia, or Missouri, that they do have some specific laws pertaining to restricting the sale of body parts. Over in the United Kingdom, things are only slightly different, with the decision of what to do with the amputated limbs and removed tissue being left to the discretion of the hospital trusts, and in some cases the individual surgeon performing the amputation itself. However, as long as the patient makes their wishes clear and signs the necessary forms, in most cases one shouldn't have significant issue getting the bits of yourself back. Also, as in the United States, tests need to be performed to ensure the tissue or limb doesn't pose a public health risk, and it will need to be properly preserved before being returned. One thing that is different in the UK, though, is that due to a quirk in British law, one of the few things a patient can't do with an amputated limb once they get it back is have it cremated at a licensed crematorium. As noted in a paper published in the BMJ, formerly British Medical Journal, in the paper Dr. Simon Marlowe also muses over the fact that although you can't legally have a crematorium cremate your limb after it's amputated, you could ask for it back and burn it yourself. And of course, if the limb is not going to be used for medical research, hospitals themselves almost universally will incinerate the limb anyway, which is all perfectly legal. It's just the crematoriums that can't do it. But to sum up here, it would seem in most regions of the world, as long as the bits of you removed don't pose a significant health risk to the general public, while many a doctor or hospital, particularly research hospitals, may resist if you ask for a body part back, if you're insistent enough, you'll likely have good luck in having it returned. And once you have it back, for the most part, you're pretty free to do with it as you please. Now, obviously, losing a limb is nearly always less than ideal, unless I suppose you have body integrity identity disorder, but for those who persist on finding the positive in any situation, if the aforementioned Christy Loyal is any indication, there are a lot of hilarious things you can do with your severed limb. And now for some bonus facts. The general lack of laws concerning what you can do with body parts can result in a number of unique quandaries, such as in the case of a South Carolina man, John Wood, who left his leg in an old barbecue smoker after having it amputated in the hopes of someday having it buried alongside him when he died. This plan was cut short when the barbecue was purchased by another man, Shannon Wisenant, when Wood fell on hard times. Indeed, Wood failed to remember that he had put the leg in there and never removed it from the barbecue. After having the police confirm that the leg wasn't part of a murder case or some other foul play, Wisenant had the leg embalmed and began charging neighbors to look at it, prompting a furious Wood to sue him to have the leg returned. The problem was that although the leg unequivocally once belonged to Wood, Wisenant was now its legal owner. The case was eventually settled on the Judge Mathis show, with Wisenant being ordered to return the leg and Wood being ordered to pay Wisenant $5,000 for it. And now for another bonus fact. The California law stating that patients can't sue after the fact for the return of tissue used in medical research or for a share of the profits if the tissue removed led to a medical breakthrough was solidified by the Supreme Court of California in 1990 after a hairy cell leukemia patient called John Moore discovered that, without his knowledge or consent, cells from his body were used to develop a new treatment to help those being treated for cancer and various other conditions. In a nutshell, doctors discovered that his cells were producing a protein that stimulates the growth of white blood cells. Ultimately, the doctors involved were able to use his cells to develop a cell line used for creating the protein GM-CSF, which in turn is used to boost the immune system of those undergoing cancer treatments and other instances where such a boost can be beneficial. Moore became suspicious that something weird was going on, owing to the doctors having him fly down to California from Washington on a monthly basis for years, continually taking blood samples, despite there being no medical reason for this to happen so frequently. The whole thing got even weirder after he asked to to have his checkups transferred to a local doctor, and the doctor in charge of Moore's care, Dr. David Gold, countered by offering to pay all of Moore's travel expenses for each visit to LA. Eventually, Dr. Gold asked Moore to sign a consent form which stated, "I voluntarily grant to the University of California all rights I or my heirs may have in any cell line or other potential product which might be developed from the blood and or bone marrow obtained from me." Even still, they did not tell him why they wanted him to sign this, nor that they were already using his cells. It wasn't until Moore hired an attorney to look into the matter that the attorney discovered a cell line had been developed and patented using Moore's genetic material, and further, that Dr. Gold had been granted 75,000 shares in the patent. Further, his group was given $330,000 for exclusive access to Moore's genetic material. Moore thus argued that he was entitled to a share of the profits, not just because it was his genetic material used, but also because, had he been informed in the first place, he could have potentially sold his genetic material to other labs or companies wanting to do similar research on his blood. Despite all of this, the ruling of the court went against Moore, primarily because doctors have long regularly used samples from patients for research, with one of the judges noting that allowing patients to sue in this way would create a litigation lottery that could kneecap medical research in an unprecedented manner. Thus, while isolated instances may seem a bit unfair, in the end, a greater societal good is achieved by allowing such research without a lot of red tape. The California Supreme Court did, however, note that doctors needed to inform patients when using their tissue for research. In the end, even though the court did not order it, as a sort of apology, UCLA Medical Center paid Moore's legal fees because he wasn't informed about what they were doing with his cells each time they were having him fly down, and he hadn't agreed to allow his cells to be used for research. As you probably might expect, the rules surrounding how one goes about donating one's body to science varies a little from region to region, though the general process and what happens after you donate seems to be relatively consistent. For instance, in the United Kingdom, donating one's body typically involves nothing more than filling out a few forms provided by your nearest university or medical school. Under British law and the Human Tissue Act of 2004, written and witnessed consent is required prior to death for a medical authority to claim a body, and it's highly recommended that you make your family aware of your wishes to expedite the process of transporting your body after death. The latter is important as it is not possible in the UK for your next of kin to override your final wishes in regards to organ and body donation, and just in general, it's a really good idea to process your body lest it get rejected for not being, for lack of a better phrase, fresh enough. Speaking of organ donation and body rejection, in most cases being an organ donor whose organs are harvested will disqualify you from subsequently donating your body to science directly, though there is a potential loophole in the United States in going through a body broker, which we're going to get to in a moment. However, it is possible to be both a body and organ donor simultaneously, regardless of what side of the pond you're on. In the event your organs are deemed unsuitable for transplantation, the relevant medical authority you've willed ownership of your body to can choose to take your body or not at their discretion. On that note, while there are no universal rules for what condition your body has to be in at the time of death for a medical authority to be able to make use of it, a number of things can exclude you immediately from being considered. For instance, you'll almost certainly be disqualified from donating your body if you die of a communicable illness or anything that doesn't have a known cause, but which may be communicable. In fact, among the first things done to donated bodies beyond refrigerating them to slow decomposition is to test them for any infectious diseases. After this, the body will typically be embalmed, although there are exceptions to this, such as if it's being used for a study on how the body decomposes naturally over time in certain scenarios, as is sometimes done with CSI training or investigation. Another way your body will usually be disqualified is if you die in a manner which renders it in any way abnormal. So, for example, if you die in a severe car crash or from a disease which wastes away your organs or muscles, it may be rejected due to the fact that institutions accepting bodies usually only want cadavers that are representative of a healthy adult. As one source puts it, in a way, to successfully donate your body, you have to be in perfect health, but dead. But again, there are always exceptions, and for example, researchers wanting to study some disease or the effects of a given car crash may be interested in your body, just particularly in the latter case, that can be hard to arrange beforehand. Even if your body is relatively unscathed at the time of your death, if you die under mysterious or suspicious circumstances and an autopsy needs to be performed, there's a good chance this too will result in your body being rejected. Other things that can result in your body being rejected, according to a non-exhaustive list provided by the University of Liverpool, include bed sores being present on your body at the time of death, dying of an aortic aneurysm, and being obese. Your body could also potentially be rejected if the relevant medical authority simply has no room for any more bodies, or you happen to die at a time of year when nobody is around to study your corpse in a relatively timely manner, such as during the holidays in late December. It's also important to note that in the event your body is rejected, the medical authority you willed it to will take no responsibility for your body's disposal, and the relevant funeral costs will thus fall to your estate. On the other hand, if your body is accepted, the medical authority studying it will often, depending on the wishes of you or your family, cremate the remains free of charge or otherwise return them to your family for a private service at your own expense. Interestingly, because medical institutions potentially cover the costs of the disposal of your body, a not insignificant number of Britons have relatively recently started to opt in to donating their body to science in the hopes that if their body is accepted, their loved ones won't have to pay any expensive funeral costs. In Britain, this is a pretty significant expense. In 2016, it's estimated that the average funeral cost £3,702, which is about $5,000. Now let's hop over the pond. In the United States, the criteria for donating a body to science is basically the same, and they require you to sign a few forms signaling consent prior to death. And again, it's a good idea to inform your family of your wishes in regards to body disposal, because as in the UK, the ultimate decision of what happens to your body rests with your kin. As the Forensic Anthropology Center of the University of Tennessee puts it, regardless of what you have arranged, signed, or instructed, your family or next of kin has the final say. We will not fight your family for your body. We urge you to convince your family that the donation is what you want at your death. Also, like in the UK, certain factors can render your body unsuitable for study, and for the most part, they're fairly comparable. Death from extreme trauma, infectious disease, and certain cancers can all cause your body to be rejected, as can being obese. On that note, most medical institutions in the United States place a height and weight limit on the cadavers they'll accept. Usually limited to 6 feet, that's 1.83 meters, and a max of between 180 and 200 pounds, that's 82 to 91 kilograms, depending on the medical institution. The main reasons for these restrictions are practical in nature, with it being noted that transporting obese bodies is more difficult, and the medical tables typically used aren't large enough to accommodate pleasantly plump corpses or those who are very tall. On top of this, dissecting obese bodies is more difficult owing to having to slice through a lot of fat to get to what's being studied. Having organs and arteries and the like a bit more accessible thanks to low body fat percentage is just easier to work with. Or, as Louisiana State University professor Stephen Helmsfield very frankly states, when you're doing medical dissection and you're up to your elbows in fat, it's greasy and unpleasant. In the UK, no such height limit is explicitly specified in any literature we could find, although especially large persons are advised that their bodies might be rejected, with the common reason listed being difficulty in moving the body. Unlike Britons, thanks to competition for bodies being stiff in the States, petite American citizens have a great deal of choice when it comes to donating their body to science. And if you're wondering why competition is stiffer in the US, well, other than the greater number of institutions needing bodies, only a small fraction of the 100 million or so people who opt into organ donation end up opting into alternatively donating their body to science. This is despite full body donation arguably being just as beneficial as organ donation, if not more so in some cases, in that the benefit to science can potentially help many people instead of just a maximum of a handful as in organ donation. And it's important to note that as with organ donation, a single body can and often is used for several research projects. As the Associate Director of Education at Indiana University School of Medicine, Ernest Tellerico, notes, you literally help tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands with a donation. It's not only those who learn from you, it's also the research and those who learn from the research. Because of the high need for bodies, some companies in the US have made a fortune acting as a middleman of sorts between families and scientific institutions. Said companies generally offer to pay the costs of cremation and the transportation and storage of the body to and from wherever it is needed. For instance, ScienceCare has taken the idea to its logical extreme, comparing themselves to McDonald's in that they deliver a product, in this case human bodies and body parts, of a consistent quality, regardless of where the institution wanting the body or body part is in the country. In fact, it's reported that from 2012 to 2014 alone, ScienceCare brought in a cool $12.5 million selling human remains, which is only publicly known due to certain court filings. Another body broker, Research for Life, notes that they typically get about $2,500 to $3,000 profit per full body. As for gross cost, documents from another body broker, Biological Resource Center, showed that they were charging $5,893 per whole body in 2013, but could potentially make more if slicing the body up. For instance, they listed a price of $1,900 for a spine, $3,500 for a torso, and $1,300 for a leg. One of the main controversies with such for-profit body brokers is that it's not clear how many of the people signing up to them realize these companies generate income by selling body parts or whole bodies from those who donated their deceased selves to the companies. To be fair though, it should be noted that, at least in the case of ScienceCare, their donor consent form does explicitly state the for-profit nature of the company. And for those wanting to increase the odds that their family won't have to shell out any money for disposing of one's remains, companies like these do offer a reasonably good outlet. As previously noted, some body brokers also allow you to donate your organs first, and then they take the rest of you to sell off at their discretion. With most all of these companies, though, you just have to understand that what happens to your body after they get it isn't generally something you or your loved ones have much say in. For instance, certain of these organizations have taken advantage of the fact that there is little in the way of oversight in the body donation industry, unlike organ donation, which is regulated. This means they've sometimes used bodies in ways explicitly against the wishes of the deceased when they filled out the paperwork. Other such companies simply note right there on the application form that they can't be sure what your body or body parts will ultimately be used for. So, as with everything in life, even in death, if you're getting a product for free, odds are reasonable you're the product. It's just that, in this case, the old adage is a little more literal than usual. Some people, of course, have a huge problem with such for-profit body broker companies, while others are just happy to maximize the odds of their loved ones not having to pay for an expensive burial or cremation, caring little about what's done with their corpse. Moving swiftly on, whether donating to a medical institution directly or to a body broker, there's a wide range of career options available to the discerning corpse, not just in giving medical students incredibly valuable practice working on a human body that doesn't care if they screw up. As for these dead body career options, doctors may use your body to train in some new and innovative surgical method or with some new piece of equipment. Being able to use your corpse for this can be a huge benefit in reducing the risks of mistakes when operating on the living. A somewhat more exciting cadaver career path can be found at the University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Center, where they have been watching bodies decompose in various ways for about 3 decades. If you live within 200 miles and they accept your body, they'll even transport it for free. One of the many ways in which they might use your body is to mimic various ways in which people are murdered and then just observe the effects on your body, possibly even over the span of many years. They may also use a living picture of you to observe the change in your appearance as you decompose in order to help them figure out how a given corpse probably looked in life. This and many other experiments provide incredibly valuable data to a variety of fields, most notably, in this case, crime scene investigation. If being murdered after you die and then closely observed as you rot away isn't your thing, when you donate your body, some institutions allow for selecting to donate to safety testing. While this might seem a bit bizarre if you've never heard of it before, the use of dead bodies in car safety testing is something every car manufacturer benefits from when testing some new safety device or a car design. However, it does seem that when asked, most manufacturers seem to outright deny that they test this way. Now, for some, it's technically true that they don't, in that they may simply donate funds to various medical institutions that, in turn, at the behest of the company and the National Highway Traffic Administration, use bodies to test their cars and their safety equipment. This means it's not technically the car company doing it, but come on. Depending on the nature of the deal, the data collected may be available to all car companies and the public, or in some cases, such as with Ford's inflatable seatbelts, the information may only be shared with the company and the National Highway Traffic Administration. In these proprietary cases, the information is declared by the company as confidential business information. This means the information is not available even through a Freedom of Information Act request. Perhaps gruesome to some, the use of your body in this way can potentially save thousands of lives, as no artificial crash test dummy perfectly mimics the human body like, well, a human body. As former Ford safety researcher Priya Prasad notes, even though we have very good math modeling of dummies, human modeling hasn't reached that state yet. For anyone wondering here, we did check, and as far as we can tell, neither Ferrari nor Lamborghini offer such a program. Now, this could mean that they don't do it, or like the example previously, they just pay someone who's not technically them to do it. Either way, given the number of non-sports car models produced is much greater than the blazing fast variety, keep in mind that if you opt to have your body used in safety testing and you're selected for crash testing, your corpse will probably end up stuck in a rather boring family car. Beyond crash tests, there are countless other ways in which your body might be used if you opt for safety testing. This includes testing various helmet types. In fact, some dead people's heads are presently being used to design better helmets for those who participate in American football. As you might imagine, the NFL is particularly interested in this line of research, but it's also potentially massively beneficial for the many thousands of teens who play the sport. In the end, if something is used to protect a human in some way and it's made by a major corporation, odds are strong that at some point said device was tested on dead people, generally via grants given to medical institutions who actually have access to these bodies. If having your head put in prototype helmets and bashed up against hard surfaces, or having your body involved in a minivan crash isn't your thing, there is another slightly more badass sounding option. This would be to donate your body to a medical institution and opt to have it used by the military. If accepted, your body will likely be loaded with state-of-the-art sensors and then used to help test new weapons and armor, or just used in testing things like a given explosive's effect on a human body. Yes, if you'd like to help protect the troops or help in the design of making weapons for making more bodies, you too can potentially have your corpse blown up for military science. Or if you're more of a pacifist, you could have the option to spend the afterlife as a skeleton, but not like any other skeleton. A skeleton examined by countless researchers. Yes, there are numerous anthropology departments across the world who can take your body and strip it down to such for study and research. In these cases, of course, your skeleton will likely not be cremated or otherwise returned to your loved ones. On this note, the University of Tennessee currently boasts an impressive collection of around 1,000 full human skeletons. They note, every individual donated to the skeletal collection is used to educate, train, and provide a resource for research in forensic taphonomy. And for the extreme exhibitionists among you, it's even possible to donate your body, or at least part of it, to be put on public display. Besides the famed Body Worlds exhibition, the Martyr Museum in Philadelphia is one option for such. So to sum up, whatever you'd like your body to be used for when you're done with it, donating your body to science is simply a matter of first contacting a relevant authority or institution. Usually your local medical school is your best bet, though if you just want the free body disposal and don't care about what's done with your corpse, a body broker isn't necessarily a bad option. Either way, you'll then only need to fill out a quick few forms to signal your consent in order to make it happen. And it's also best to explicitly mention to your loved ones that those are your wishes in order to make sure that things go smoothly after you die. Also, for most every option, you should generally plan that your estate may need to at least pay for transportation of the body, and also the possibility that your body may be rejected when the time comes, meaning funds for a more traditional body disposal will be needed. And hey, if your body is accepted and the institution chooses to go ahead and handle all the fees, that's just extra money freed up for use by your loved ones to throw a better party in your honor with. And have some bonus facts. It's speculated that the likely reasons for the large disparity between people opting into organ donation versus full body donation in the United States is that donating one's entire body is somewhat stigmatized, which is the opposite of organ donation, which is celebrated. Further, arranging to donate your body to science requires slightly more effort than just checking a box on a form when renewing your driver's license or the like. Further, the average American male simply has a body outside of the height and weight range typically accepted by most medical institutions. That's a max of 180 to 200 pounds and being 6 feet tall. For reference here, the average adult American male rings in at about 195 pounds and 5 feet 10 inches tall. That's 1.8 meters, according to the CDC. Given that this is more the norm than the more physically fit bodies many medical students and doctors practice on, there has been some call of late to start accepting bodies with a bit more girth and height, so said medical students will end up getting more first-hand experience with the type of bodies they're likely to frequently work on in their career. However, the practical side of things still rules the day at present, though many institutions are starting to transition to bigger tables and particularly loosening their guidelines on weight restriction on accepted bodies. As the aforementioned Professor Hemsfield states, I don't think you need a room full of obese cadavers, but I still think there's a usefulness for students. I think to give them a sense of what the effects of obesity can be on a person's body, there's nothing like the real thing. So it turns out renouncing your citizenship to a given nation is generally a fairly simple affair in many regions of the world. It doesn't even usually cost that much. For example, in the UK, fittingly for a country stereotypically known for its aversion to social conflict, renouncing your citizenship can be done by mail and costs £272. In the US, it's a bit more expensive, jumping in price almost 400% in the last decade, up now to $2,350. The price hike was in response to the dramatic rise in people renouncing their citizenship starting in around 2010, which we're going to focus on in the bonus facts later. But as for the actual process, according to the US Department of State, outside of settling potential tax bills, affirming you're renouncing voluntarily and the like, which is pretty standard with most nations, in a nutshell, all one needs to do is appear in person before a US consular or diplomatic officer and sign an oath of renunciations. You'll then later receive a certificate of loss of nationality, signifying that you are no longer a US citizen. Now, if the person does not already have citizenship with another nation when they attempt to do this, the State Department employee will counsel the person on the many difficulties the individual will soon face if they choose to go through with renouncing their citizenship. You see, should they do this without being a citizen of another nation, they will become what is known as stateless. While difficulties vary for stateless people depending on the country they currently reside in general, many otherwise commonplace things can potentially become very problematic for those people, like getting a job, getting access to education for their kids or themselves, getting citizenship for the potential future children, ability to get married, get a driver's license, rent or buy a house, travel across borders, or even just getting something simple like a bank account. A bigger problem for some is the loss of certain legal protections that they'd otherwise be guaranteed. On this note, in the United States, the over 4 million stateless people residing in America can potentially be arrested without having committed any crime and jailed for many months, generally while the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement people try to find a country to deport them to, if at all possible. In fact, before 2001, stateless people, as well as certain immigrants in the United States, could be detained in this way indefinitely. However, that all changed with the case of Zadvydas and Davis. As a child, Zadvydas immigrated to the US legally with his parents not long after World War II. He later committed a crime and, after serving his sentence, was slated to be deported. The problem was that he was born in a displaced persons camp in Lithuania in 1948, and neither Lithuania nor Germany would claim him as a citizen when the US tried to deport him. After 3 years of being detained in this way, with no country willing to take him, the US Supreme Court ruled that the government cannot detain immigrants, legal or not, or stateless people indefinitely, even if a deport order has been secured through the courts. A maximum of 6 months for the detained period was then set. Unless it appeared removal seemed likely in the process of negotiations with whatever foreign country, then the individual can be detained longer. Even so, the fact that they can be detained on a whim at all is a very real problem for stateless people, particularly in recent times with efforts ramped up to deport certain non-citizens. As noted, Professor of Immigration Law David Baloarte said, "Many systems of immigration have the assumption that if they can't stay here, they have somewhere else to go to. Stateless people end up being uniquely disadvantaged because they can be picked up, scheduled for deportation, and then no one knows what to do with them. US immigration authorities spend a lot of time trying to remove these people. It's like they live on parole, having to live on the whim of immigration policy. When there are problems in their immigration status, a stateless person can do nothing." This said, it is possible to live a fairly normal life as a stateless person in some countries, even in the United States. For example, in the US, it is possible for a stateless person to get a work visa and therefore get employment, as well as other provisions that can be applied for and potentially, though not necessarily, granted. As another example, in Hong Kong, a stateless person can apply for things like an unconditional stay visa, which grants them some basic rights without actually conferring any citizenship status. A similar example is the case of native Russians living in the Schengen area after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For those unfamiliar, this is a collection of 26 countries in Europe where there's no passport control between their borders. What happened here is that when the Soviet Union was broken up, under the laws of the time, native Russians living in certain areas of Europe couldn't apply for citizenship in those countries, and some, for one reason or another, chose not to apply for Russian citizenship or were denied when they did go to apply. Although technically stateless, these people can nonetheless still travel freely about the Schengen area, meaning the problems with crossing borders for the stateless in their case is lessened to some degree. Alright, so this all brings us to the surprising number of ways one can become stateless involuntarily. To start with, the aforementioned example of a nation breaking up tends to see a relatively large spike in stateless people in the aftermath, generally because for some people none of the new nations will accept them, sometimes for ethnic or religious reasons, and sometimes just because records are lost or destroyed, and so nobody has the needed documentation to prove citizenship for a small subset of the population. For this reason, and the difficulty in crossing borders, a rather odd quirk of stateless people is that the majority of them were born and raised in the very place, or sometimes even in the still existing nation, that will not claim them as a citizen. On this note, it's worth explicitly mentioning here that many nations do not automatically grant citizenship based on birth location, but based on other factors, things like the citizenship of the parents, or in some cases of only one parent, which is often the father. This is rather unfortunate for the children of parents who are stateless. There are also cases where a child might not be recognized because they were conceived out of wedlock, such as in Saudi Arabia, where that child might not be granted citizenship. In other cases, if the father will not claim the child, or where the father isn't known, even if the mother is a citizen, it likewise may not matter, and the child may be denied citizenship. As another example of how a child can be born stateless, in some nations, if a baby is born outside of the nation's boundaries, such as with Cuban citizens, and the nation where the child is born will not grant them citizenship, even if the parents are both Cuban, Cuba will not necessarily grant the child citizenship. Thus, there is potential for the child to end up stateless if application for citizenship is denied, and this situation is not unique to Cuba. As yet another way some people are born stateless, this can occasionally just come down to bad record keeping or a failure of the parents or hospital to properly register the baby at their birth. Unsurprisingly, from the many ways it's possible for someone to become involuntarily stateless and to the many downsides existing in such a state, this is considered a pretty big world problem today, with it known that there are at least 12 million stateless people worldwide, with the actual figure thought to be significantly higher. In response, the UN Refugee Agency has relatively recently launched a campaign to end statelessness by 2024 and is in the process of working with various nations to try and make that happen. But coming back to those rare individuals who voluntarily become stateless, this is actually hard to do in most countries, with one of the few exceptions being the aforementioned case of the United States. So how do other nations get around this problem? As a typical example, British citizens who want to formally renounce their nationality must have either dual nationality or have provisions in place to receive citizenship from another country. This latter point is important because certain countries require you to renounce any form of citizenship before you can become a citizen of the new country. So what happens here if you renounce your citizenship but then get denied in the new country? Helpfully, in the UK, if the person renouncing their citizenship doesn't receive citizenship from another country within 6 months after they've applied to relinquish their nationality, the decision will be quashed and they will remain a British citizen to stop them from becoming stateless. This is more or less how most countries handle the situation. However, no such provision exists in the United States. If the person in question can't or simply doesn't attain citizenship from another country before the decision to renounce their nationality is finalized, they will be considered stateless and can only hope that another nation will grant them citizenship. But to sum up, renouncing your citizenship is a mildly costly, though generally surprisingly easy process that results in you losing the benefits and protections of being a citizen of the country you're relinquishing your citizenship to. It's a decision that should never be taken lightly and is usually irreversible, but is also essential if you want to become a citizen of certain foreign countries. However, with the exception of a few countries like the United States, if you choose to renounce to become a citizen of one of those countries that requires this is done beforehand, and then that country denies your application, your original country will simply cancel your request to rescind your citizenship to keep you from becoming one of the many millions worldwide that have found themselves in the unfortunate state of being stateless. And let's get into those bonus facts. Now, you might have initially thought that the sudden rise in Americans renouncing their citizenship around 2010, going from about 1,000 people per year in 2010 and then rising every year since up to 6,000 people in 2016, must have something to do with the rather polarized political climate. But it actually had to do with a side effect of trying to stop certain wealthy individuals from getting out of paying their taxes. And this is where the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act of 2010 enters the picture. Fully explaining the purpose and the ramifications of this act would take quite some time, so we're just going to quote Congressman Charles Rangel, who summed it up rather nicely. The overall purpose of the law is to detect, deter, and discourage offshore tax abuses through increased transparency, enhanced reporting, and strong sanctions. Unfortunately for the little guy, this saw ordinary Americans living in foreign countries being forced to submit a second tax return regardless of where in the world they lived and whether or not they already paid their taxes in that country. Prior to this act, if said citizens living abroad made less than $106,000 per year, they were not subject to this quasi-double taxation. It should be noted, though, that if one does pay taxes in the foreign nation, tax credits are applied by the IRS, so it's not usually a full double taxation. It's also worthy of note that the US is almost the only nation on Earth to have such a citizen-based taxation system rather than it being based on where the person lives. In any event, even if the person in question was willing to be double taxed, because of some of the rules surrounding this act, it also had a side effect of making many foreign banks unwilling to allow membership or deal with any Americans at all. So why is this? Well, in a nutshell, the IRS required all foreign banks to disclose account information, assets, etc. of any person holding American citizenship who dealt with the bank. Failure to do so would result in rather severe penalties for the bank should they wish to deal with any US institution. Thus, rather than deal with the paperwork overhead and potential to make a mistake, in the case where someone maybe has dual citizenship or the like and the bank didn't know that they had this American citizenship, many banks just choose to blanket deny service to anyone they know holds American citizenship. Naturally, many of these people, some who haven't lived in the United States for decades, decided to simply renounce their American citizenship to get around the double taxation problem and the occasional hassles about bank accounts. And now for another bonus fact. Perhaps the most famous renouncer of American citizenship because of this tax law change is the former Mayor of London and British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. While he was born to British parents, they were in the US at the time of his birth, granting him US citizenship. He'd go on to grow up in Britain, but never bothered to go through the process of renouncing his US citizenship until the change in tax law, around which time he was forced to pay the US taxes on some house he sold. Peeved at having to pay such taxes in the US for a house that he sold in Britain, he promptly paid the taxes and renounced his US citizenship. On this note, before you are allowed to renounce your citizenship to the United States, you must first pay all owed taxes. For those who make over $160,000 or so a year and have over $2 million in assets, they also tack on a rather hefty exit tax on your estate. It's also worth noting that renouncing your US citizenship also results in your name being added to a private FBI register and the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. And now for another bonus fact. There is one advantage to being stateless if you happen to wish to be an Olympian. Stateless people can compete at the Olympics as an independent athlete of no nation. In these exceptional cases, the athlete will compete under a simple white flag bearing the Olympic logo and will be assisted by the Olympic Committee to make visiting a given foreign nation to compete as painless as possible. That being said, there is no guarantee that they will be able to travel to compete in the Olympics. Though many athletes competing under no nation are technically stateless, they're usually from newly independent countries that have yet to form an official Olympic committee. And now for a final bonus fact. Contrary to what is sometimes said, renouncing your citizenship doesn't mean you can never go back. Assuming you are a citizen of another country after renouncing, you can still generally travel back to your former country under the same type of rules and regulations as anyone else from whatever country you've attained citizenship from travels under. To a lot of people, the idea of a person leaving money in their will to a pet instead of a charity or, their own family or friends seems something only an eccentric wealthy person would do. In reality, though, a pet trust, it's not only surprisingly common, but it's one most legal experts recommend for any pet owner who cares for their animal. But how do you go about accomplishing this and making sure your wishes are followed? Despite sounding like something you'd need an army of lawyers to draft into a will to make sure the courts would allow such a thing, in truth, any lawyer worth their salt who has knowledge of wills should be able to relatively inexpensively add provisions to an estate to plan care for a pet. In fact, every state in the United States, with the exception of Minnesota, has laws on the books detailing pet trusts and their enforcement to help simplify things just a little bit. For those in the UK who are watching, British law also has similar provisions which allow pet owners to make provisions for a pet in their will. So yes, you can actually leave a house to a pet, though if you wanted that pet to be able to keep
keep the house, you would need to add in some funds for necessary taxes, upkeep, and of course specify someone to actually take care of the animal in question and properly incentivize them to do so. As not all pets are created equal, pet owners are advised to be as pedantic as they want when it comes to laying out the terms of a pet trust and how the pet should be cared for. This can be as simple as specifying how often said pet has to be taken for a walk to what brand of baby food that it has to be fed. That last one is actually a stipulation taken directly from the will of singer Dusty Springfield for how her beloved cat Nicholas should be taken care of. So yes, even oddball requirements can be put in. Okay, so this brings us to the money. Now for most pet owners, it is unsurprisingly advised to set aside enough money in a trust to take care of the animal in question for the duration of its projected natural lifespan in accordance with the manner of care to which it is accustomed. As some people have more money than others, this is where pet trusts can get a little silly. For example, there was a case of someone who left a $13 million estate to a cat that they rescued. If you do leave such an insanely valuable estate to a pet, while many families may attempt to challenge your will in hopes of getting the money for themselves, assuming you hired a reasonably competent estate lawyer to draw up the whole thing, there usually shouldn't be any issue, though there are occasional exceptions, as with everything. So how does the dog or cat actually get the money you left? Well, in short, they don't directly. If you put in your will that you leave your cat along with $5,000 to be used for its care to your sister, the money will ultimately be doled out to your sister by the executor of the will, and after that, depending on the region you live, your sister may or may not be free to do with the money what she will. In fact, it can even be the case that she can leave the cat on the side of the road on the way home if she so chooses. That said, some regions do have pet trust laws that help get around this issue, allowing you to simply say something like, I leave $5,000 to be used for the care of my pet fish, and be reasonably sure that things will be executed such that the money will be used appropriately. However, just to make absolutely sure when you are making a simple directive like this in a will, it's best to designate a trusted person as the caretaker and/or simply set up a pet trust explicitly. On that note, explicitly setting up a trust has another huge advantage over just bequeathing money to your pet and relying on statutory pet trust laws, if any. If you do the latter, there will be a gap between when you die and when your will goes through the probate process, potentially meaning no one is taking care of your pet in the interim. If the funds needed to care for the pet aren't available until, say, a house is sold or the like, this might be a very long gap. By setting up the trust when you're alive, the trust takes effect the moment you die, getting around the problem completely. You may also stipulate in your will a trust to be set up upon your death to your specifications, called a testamentary trust. However, this suffers from the same delay period in which no one is obliged to ensure your pet's care, and no funds may be available for that care for some amount of time. In either case, as with a trust fund for a child, in this case, when a pet is bequeathed an amount of money, and perhaps even something like a house for its care, a trustee is appointed, either by the courts or by the will holder prior to death, to decide how and when potential funds get distributed. The money will inevitably be paid to a designated caretaker who will physically take care of the animal in accordance with the wishes stipulated in the will. To ensure that no shenanigans ensue, you may specify an enforcer should be appointed to keep tabs on how the money is being spent and ensure that no funds are misappropriated by either the trustee or the caretaker. This system gives both peace of mind to a person looking to care for their pet after they die and ensures that their final wishes are respected. Now, in many such cases, a designated caretaker will see some benefit from taking care of a given animal, either in the form of money for their time or even the ability to live in a piece of property the animal inherited. This gives caretakers an incentive to keep the animal alive and cared for, but also means there's an incentive to cheat the system. As lawyer Gideon Rothschild of Moses and Singers notes, there's a risk that when the cat dies and the person doesn't want to stop taking their money, they'll go out and buy a cat that looks exactly like the other cat so they don't have to stop. As such, it's recommended to do such things as include some mechanism to ensure the pet being cared for is really your former pet, even potentially requiring DNA testing of the animal upon your death and regular checkups thereafter, or potentially limiting the amount of time a trustee will pay out to a caretaker for a given pet, with the time frame being around the likely lifespan of said pet. Some even opt to include an additional stipulation that will compensate the caretaker should the animal die to help ensure they accurately report the death. This later one comes with an additional problem that a caretaker may decide to go all aristocrats on the dead person's pets and try to kill them to get the lump sum sooner. This potentially necessitates further stipulations in the will to cover all such scenarios in a way that ensures that your pet is cared for to your liking. Again, we should highlight that there's nothing wrong with being overly pedantic in setting up such a pet trust to ensure that your wishes are being followed exactly without any loopholes. At this point, you now might be wondering what happens to any money left over when the animal itself dies. Unless otherwise specified in the form of a remainder beneficiary being noted, it will likely be absorbed back into your estate and bequeathed appropriately from there, though if you literally did not specify at all what is to be done, there's potential that the courts end up deciding this one, so it's best to be explicit here as well. Whether you specify a remainder beneficiary or not, this may provide another risk factor to your pet from particularly unscrupulous individuals. For instance, if you were to leave a house and appropriate funds to your cat and give the rest of your estate to, for instance, your cousin, or similarly, if you explicitly stipulated that once the cat dies, the cousin gets any remaining funds, this gives that person incentive to accidentally run over the cat or feed it antifreeze or the like. To get around this issue, it's not uncommon for people to stipulate that remaining funds simply go to a non-profit organization like an animal shelter or the like. On that note, we should address what happens if the amount of money you leave to an animal is so exorbitant that it gets challenged in court by those who feel the money should have gone to them. This shouldn't be a problem at all if everything was set up right, but it can occasionally be for outside reasons. To illustrate this, let's refer to perhaps the most famous example of animal nepotism, Trouble the dog. Formerly owned by the so-called Queen of Mean, eccentric billionaire businesswoman Leona Helmsley, Trouble was a Maltese bequeathed $12 million after Helmsley's death in 2007. Upon this particular stipulation being contested, owing to it being determined that Helmsley was mentally unfit when the will was written, a judge famously ruled that this amount was far greater than was needed to care for the dog, even taking into account its lifestyle of being hand-fed things like fresh crab cakes and steamed vegetables. Instead, the judge awarded the dog, who it should be noted was already fairly elderly for the breed at 12 years old, the average Maltese lives 12 to 15 years, a more conservative $2 million. The other $10 million originally designated was given to two of Helmsley's grandchildren, total of $3 million each, who she had disinherited for unspecified reasons, unlike her other grandchildren who all received large sums, and the remaining $4 million went to Harry B. Helmsley's charitable trust. Beyond the dog suddenly losing $10 million, the new caretaker of Trouble, Carl Leckick, the general manager of Helmsley Sandcastle Hotel, famously switched from feeding Trouble her high-end fare to simply giving her run-of-the-mill canned dog food. As for the rest of the money, this amount not only paid for her now mostly common dog food to the tune of about $100 a month, but also care, grooming at an astounding $8,000 per year, medical bills at $2,500 to $18,000 per year owing to kidney and other health problems, and a caretaker fee at $60,000 per year, as well as full-time security, which cost $100,000 per year. If the last one sounds odd, it should be noted that the well-publicized dog was the frequent recipient of death and kidnapping threats, and even had to travel under an alias at one point for her own protection. For the curious, Trouble passed away 4 years after her former master in 2011, and the remainder of the dog's fortune, given the quoted numbers, presumably about $1.3 million, reverted back to the aforementioned Helmsley Charitable Trust, which Helmsley had previously bequeathed a little over $4 billion to, the bulk of her estate. Today, that trust is worth over $5 billion and has issued grants totaling about $1.6 billion to fund various organizations and research. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, what happens if the money in the trust runs out and the pet is still living? In this case, it's common to simply let the caregiver decide what happens, perhaps continuing to care for the animal if they want to, or perhaps not. However, if you're not comfortable leaving it up to said individual, you may specify exactly what you want done here as well, such as giving the animal to a no-kill shelter or the like, in the hopes that they'll be able to find a new home for it with someone who will care for it of their own volition, rather than because of some financial incentive.
Containing ice. Some listeners may recall a science class in which an excitable teacher walked to the front of the class to show off a small, cracked steel container, seemingly damaged from an incredibly powerful but tiny force, only for said teacher to reveal that the damage had been done by nothing more than water. However, what would happen if you put the water in a container it couldn't break out of and then froze it? The short answer is that the water still turns to ice. However, if it genuinely cannot break the bonds of the container it is trapped inside, it turns into a very different kind of ice than we're used to seeing. We currently know of 15 different solid phases of water, aka ice, with each type being distinct due to differing density and internal structures. The form you're most likely familiar with is hexagonal ice, which is what happens when water freezes normally under regular conditions. If you keep lowering the temperature of hexagonal ice, it eventually becomes cubic ice. Tweak the temperature and pressure further, and you can create ice 2, ice 3, all the way up to ice 15. Due to the inherent difficulty of producing such high and low pressures and temperatures, it has taken science up until as recently as 2009 to fully document every known form of ice. The majority of ice's final forms were discovered in part by a group of researchers in the chemistry department of Oxford University who were able to create ice 12, ice 14, and ice 15 for the first time. In the case of ice 15, creating it involved taking ice 6 and slamming the temperature down to minus 143 degrees Celsius before exposing it to pressure 10,000 times greater than the Earth's own atmosphere. The final form of ice, and by extension form of water, still managed to surprise even the minds at Oxford when, against all of their expectations, it proved to be totally anti-ferroelectric, being unable to hold a charge at all. But in the simplest sense, the different forms of ice are created through a varying combination of both pressure and temperature, the exact combinations of which can be found out by taking a quick look at the phase diagram of water. However, scientists can artificially tip the scales in their favor through various means. For example, when creating ice 13 and ice 14, Dr. Christoph Salzmann and his team at Oxford used careful measures of hydrochloric acid to alter the temperature needed to create the ice. If the above seems rather simple in the scheme of things, that's because it was, and other scientists, such as Professor John Finney, who was part of the team that discovered and created ice 12 in 1996, noted as much when questioned about it, commenting that Salzmann's team had done in a few years what other researchers couldn't do in 40. Back to the question at hand. Regular ice, or at least the version you were familiar with before we told you about the other 14 kinds, is capable of applying massive amounts of force when it freezes and expands. This is due to a very unique trait of water, mainly that it is less dense as a solid than as a liquid. This density disparity is due to how the molecules of water react upon freezing. Water molecules join together in a rigid hexagonal structure, which leaves a small but nonetheless significant gap between the atoms that wasn't there when the water was liquid. For the curious, water reaches its densest point at 4 degrees Celsius, any cooler or hotter, and it begins to expand. So, exactly how much force is the ice capable of exerting? Well, people have been trying to work this out for a long time. In 1784 and 1785, one Major Edward Williams took advantage of the weather in Quebec and reportedly tried and failed to find a method of containing ice. Williams at first tried to seal water inside of artillery shells, the cast iron plugs of which were launched 470 feet at an astonishing 20 feet per second when the pressure became too great. Unperturbed, Williams then took to anchoring the plugs in place using hooks, only for the shells to split in two. In another experiment, an attempt was made to fill cannons made of 1-inch thick cast iron with water, only for them too to split when it was frozen. Academics in Florence later tried to fill a ball made of 1-inch thick brass with water, only for that to crack too when it was frozen. They later worked out that the force required to do so clocked in at around 27,720 pounds. For a more exact answer, you need to once again go back to the water phase diagram, which shows that ice will turn into ice 2 when the pressure reaches 300 megapascals, which is exactly 43,511.31 pounds of force per square inch. In other words, that's the amount of pressure a container would need to be able to survive to stop water turning into regular ice, instead causing it to turn into ice 2. So, to answer the initial question, if you froze water inside a container so strong it couldn't turn into ice, it would still turn into ice, just a slightly different type of ice in terms of scientific classification and its internal structure.
So, Scrob, the fancy turtle, asks us, love your video on what happens when people are accidentally declared dead, but it got me wondering, what happens if you make a will, go missing, so your will is executed, then turn up alive later? Do you get your stuff back? Alright, so in our previous video about people being declared accidentally dead, we talked about the process of getting declared alive again and how complicated it is and all of that good stuff. However, what we didn't discuss was that many thousands more people are purposefully declared dead in absentia every year. As you probably surmised from the term used to describe these deaths, being declared dead in absentia occurs after a person goes missing. When this happens, their will is probated and their estate is settled. But what happens if they aren't dead at all and actually turn up later, perhaps after helping a tempestuous but lovable bunch of vertically challenged individuals reclaim their homelands from the clutches of the chiefest and the greatest of calamities? How do they go about getting their stuff back, or do they even have any rights to it anymore at all? To begin with, how does one go about getting declared dead in absentia in the first place? After all, in most countries, adults are perfectly within their rights to uproot and go start a new life somewhere else without telling anyone, or even going on a lengthy adventure with a wizened grey wanderer. Just before we get into all of this, we do want to quickly note that this particular topic does deal with estate distribution and the like, so we're primarily going to be focusing on adults who disappear, though many elements of what we're about to cover does also technically apply to children. As with many things, there's no uniform worldwide policy concerning what exact set of circumstances need to occur, or even how long a person needs to be missing to be declared dead in absentia. However, there are many similarities in the process from country to country. In general, the courts will have to be directly involved in these cases, as they will almost always err towards presuming the person is actually alive. However, if the person has been missing for a specific length of time, with no one who would otherwise normally hear from them having contact, and a diligent, unsuccessful search has been conducted to find them, the courts will ultimately determine that the person indeed must be deceased, even if there is no direct hard evidence that they are in fact dead. As to the search, to dispel a popular notion frequently perpetuated by Hollywood, a person does not have to be missing for more than 24 hours before the authorities in most countries will act. In fact, while almost all missing person cases are resolved of their own accord in relatively short order, in rare, more legitimate missing person cases, every hour that passes reduces the probability that said missing person will be found, and nobody is more aware of that than the authorities who deal with this stuff every single day. Thus, they often actually recommend reporting missing people as soon as the person is determined to be missing. That said, given there is only so much manpower available at any given time, and that most missing person cases resolve themselves of their own accord rather quickly, the appropriate authorities do have to prioritize which cases they take on. Thus, rather than strictly going by how much time has passed before an investigation is opened, they'll weigh a number of factors, including the probability that the person is truly missing, and not just off doing something without telling anyone. If the person's disappearance is highly unusual, given the person's normal daily habits, and no good explanation can be thought up for the disappearance, this will bump the case up the priority list as a potential legitimate missing person case. Just as important in getting the authorities to look into the matter immediately is the probability that the person missing will be in some sort of peril, given the known facts of the case. Once the investigation is started, if nobody in the person's life seems to have heard from them or knows where they are, authorities usually resort to monitoring the person's digitally trackable life. For example, where applicable, monitoring financial accounts, cell phone, email, social media accounts, etc., as well as checking if the person has attempted to go through any border checkpoints. As you might imagine, disappearing without a trace in the modern world has become increasingly difficult, meaning these days authorities are much more frequently able to locate the person if they are indeed still alive, compared to even just a few decades ago. It also helps that many people who are choosing to disappear from their previous lives are not trying to hide from the authorities, so the use of personal bank accounts and the like tends to continue. If they are found, authorities will typically respect the person's right to disappear from a former life, unless there are legal reasons not to, such as someone running from financial obligations or the like. As Miranda Napier of the Missing Persons Bureau notes, if someone has elected to leave their friends and family, and we find them and they express this wish, then we would close the missing person report and advise those making it that they were safe and well, but we would not be able to tell them where they were. Speaking of financial obligations, when trying to decide if some missing person might actually be dead, authorities will also analyze whether the person missing might have had motive to go missing in the first place. For example, if they were having extreme financial difficulties, were in legal trouble, having relationship or family problems, etc. As they move along in the process, authorities will also usually check with local coroners to see if any unidentified bodies have been found that match the description of the missing person. But what about if all of this turns up nothing? Well, next it becomes a waiting game. In regards to the length of time needed, as noted, this does vary, but a commonly observed rule of thumb is that the person has to have been missing for at least 7 years, unless circumstances of their disappearance seem to indicate imminent peril, thus a high probability that the person is in fact deceased. For example, many bodies couldn't be recovered or identified when the World Trade Center towers collapsed on 9/11. Therefore, people who worked there and went missing directly after would have an extremely high probability of being declared dead in absentia. This would happen almost immediately should the loved ones request it of the courts. Few cases are so cut and dry, however, and in all cases you generally need to get a judge to agree with you, with the burden of proof lying with the people trying to get someone declared dead earlier than the normally required number of years. The judge in these cases will then determine if, given the evidence, the probability has shifted from presuming the person is alive to it being reasonable to presume that they are dead. Again, as we mentioned, usually they will err on the side of the person still being alive. As former Assistant Attorney General of Illinois Floyd Perkins notes, before 7 years, anyone who wants you declared legally dead has to offer evidence that you're not alive. But after you've been missing 7 years, anyone who wants you declared alive has to offer evidence that you're not dead. As for more specifics, in the United States, the authority to declare someone dead in absentia falls to the states themselves. Each of these states have their own specific rules. For example, while most states go with the 7-year general rule, states like Georgia and Minnesota instead go with 4 years. Okay, so moving around to the other side of the world, in Italy, it actually takes 20 years for someone to be declared dead in absentia, barring compelling evidence to decree this sooner. In Poland, this time span is 10 years. In Russia, it's 5. Like in many states in the US and many other parts of the world, in the UK there is a 7-year waiting period before the authorities can make this call. It should be noted here that until the authorities declare the person dead, the missing person's financial affairs are basically in a state of bureaucratic limbo. To illustrate the issues here, consider the case of Vicky Derrick. This was a woman whose husband Vinny went missing in 2003. After an investigation to locate Vinny turned up nothing, he was presumed missing by the police. The problem was that in the eyes of the law, Vicky's husband was still alive and thus she was still married to him with all of the obligations that implies. For example, she shared a mortgage on a house that she could no longer afford with just a single income, but could not sell her house because her husband wasn't around but the signature on the necessary paperwork. Furthermore, Vicky couldn't claim her husband's life insurance policy nor access his personal accounts to settle his various financial obligations until the court finally decided enough time had passed to declare him dead in 2011. In a bizarre twist, Vinny's body was found just 2 months after he was finally declared dead in absentia. As Vicky would later recount, there was a huge sense of relief, which I feel guilty about. But at the time, I had already grieved. Deep down, I think I knew the day he disappeared, he wasn't coming back. It was so out of character that something terrible must have happened for him not to come home. It turns out that in the UK alone, while about 98% of the 250,000 or so people that go missing each year turn up within a week of their disappearance, about 1% of these missing people go missing for at least a year. In a little over half of these 1% cases, the person is ultimately either found dead or eventually declared dead in absentia, but the other half, over 1,000 missing people annually, turn up alive in the end. As a direct result of cases like these, the government passed the Guardianship Missing Persons Act in 2017, which, 90 days after the disappearance of the individual, allows the loved ones of a missing person to assume some degree of control over their affairs. Thanks to this, many of the problems people like Vicky faced can be avoided. This mitigates the potential damage to a missing person's financial situation, as well as providing a degree of help in cutting through a lot of red tape for their loved ones during a tumultuous time. No such nationwide laws exist in the United States. Thus, for example, if any benefits would otherwise have been paid, the beneficiaries involved usually simply have to wait the required period for the death in absentia to be declared before they can begin receiving them. This is assuming that they can't get a sufficient body of evidence showing that the person is most likely dead. Alright, so that's how you could potentially be declared dead and have your estate passed to others without actually being dead. So now let's talk about what happens to your stuff. In a nutshell, a person declared dead in absentia is, by the letter of the law, dead. It's a shocker, I know. As such, the actual process of probating their will is functionally identical to a more straightforward death in most countries. Likewise, death benefits will similarly be paid out in a timely manner, though some insurers may require a person making a claim in these cases to jump through a few additional hoops, such as providing evidence a good faith effort was made to locate the person before death in absentia was declared. With this information being necessary to declare a person dead in absentia anyway, this is usually a pretty easy hurdle to jump over at that stage of the game. But let's say that after all of this happens, the dead person turns up very much alive and wants all their stuff back from the clutches of the Sackville Baggins. Well, what happens then? This is a far more thorny legal issue, and there's little universal precedent in law to say what exactly should happen. However, in the vast majority of court cases that we found related to this, the heirs typically weren't required to give anything back. In the US, it does tend to vary state by state, with some dictating that the person has no right to any of their stuff back, and others adding caveats, including Pennsylvania, who deals with the matter most sensibly out of any region we looked at. Another state with a caveat is Nevada, where a person has up to a year after the legal proceedings dividing up their state to go and get their money and property back. If a missing person turns up after this grace period, they will no longer have any claim to their former assets. Now, to give the missing person as much of a chance as possible to prevent this from happening if they are indeed still alive, a person laying claim to the estate to the missing person, in this case, must give notice by publication. This mostly just means doing something like putting an ad in the local paper or the like and saying that they are going to make a claim on the estate. Now, the chances are that this is going to be read by no one except for the intern who processes the notice, but at least it gives the appearance of accomplishing something, so, it's a bureaucrat's dream law. Okay, so let's move on to Pennsylvania. This state law very sensibly requires anyone laying claim to a person's estate who has been declared dead in absentia to secure a refunding bond before assets will be distributed. As Pennsylvania-based attorney Patty Spencer states, the person entitled, a spouse or kid, has to post a refunding bond before the property is distributed. If the person comes back and someone else has her property, they have to give it back, and if they can't, then this bonding company has to make it right. This is something that happened relatively recently, back in 2013, when a woman named Brenda Heist returned after her presumed death in 2003. She'd been living on the street for the last decade and wasn't even aware that she'd been declared dead. UK law, as with many other countries that we looked at, seems to more or less handle things about the same as the US court system. If the person has been declared dead in absentia and sufficient time has passed, the courts will usually rule that the heirs aren't required to give anything back. We should mention, though, that heirs are free to give stuff back at their own discretion. The courts just won't require them to do so if a lawsuit is raised over the matter. But what about life insurance and various death benefits? As you might imagine, the insurance companies will almost always seek to get their money back unless the cost to do so exceeds the amount paid out. But from whom do they try to get the money back? While, as with so much of what we've just discussed, it's not universally true, if a missing person's loved ones have them declared dead in absentia and then they claim against their life insurance policy in good faith and thus aren't involved in any fraud, they won't generally be sued for the money back, or even if they are, the courts are unlikely to side with the insurance company. The life insurance companies tend to have much better luck going after the person who was incorrectly declared dead in absentia. After all, the missing person knows they are still alive and usually went missing on purpose. This set off the chain of events that required the insurance company to eventually pay out on a policy when they otherwise shouldn't have. For example, consider the case of John Burney, who disappeared in a way that made it seem very likely that he was dead. This all happened in 1976 after he got into some rather hot water owing to mismanaging his company, causing it to go bankrupt. About 6 years later, in 1982, he was found to be alive when he decided to return home to visit his father, who had been seriously injured. Although Burney's insurance company initially filed suit against the beneficiaries of his life insurance policy, specifically his wife and business partners, the courts ruled that they didn't have to return the money. Burney, however, who didn't receive a dime of that insurance money, did, to the tune of $470,000, which is about $1.2 million today. So, to sum up, if you happen to mysteriously disappear and then turn up again after being declared dead, chances are your stuff will be gone unless your beneficiaries are feeling particularly generous and choose on their own to give it back to you. And should they have cashed in on a life insurance policy that you had, assuming they really thought you were dead when they did it, you are likely going to be the one on the hook to pay that back, even if you didn't benefit from it in any way. To add insult to injury, particularly if you live in the United States, prepare yourself for quite a lengthy ordeal in getting yourself declared alive again in the first place, with a number of rather severe consequences while you try to prove to everyone that you are, in fact, not dead. Thus, unfortunately for the owner of a certain estate along Bagshot Row, given his disappearance most definitely was out of the ordinary for his normal behavior patterns, and beyond that, he was last seen, at least in the film adaptation, noting that he was going on an adventure, always a dodgy business. In either case, those seeking his estate seem perfectly within their rights to have him declared dead in absentia. This is assuming that Shire law does not have a legal right to recover an estate after such a declaration like Nevada. And in today's video, we're going to answer a viewer question because Miles Per Awesome asks us, could you get in trouble legally if you murdered someone in space asking for a friend? While it might seem like something out of science fiction, given that humans are presently in space and soon enough mass space tourism is going to open up the possibility for many, many more, it's only a matter of time before someone commits a crime in space, with it being alleged the first already occurred in 2019, which we're going to get into shortly. So what exactly happens if someone does break the law in space? Could you, say, commit murder and then get away scot-free? To begin with, while you might think it can't actually be possible to commit a crime in space because no country seemingly has jurisdiction there, you'd be wrong. Much like the myth that you can do whatever you want in international waters because no country holds sway, it turns out, among other agreements and rules, international laws are totally a thing. On that note, while aboard a given vessel, the ship you're on officially hails and is registered from some nation or group of nations like the European Union, and the laws from said entities are binding aboard it in most cases while it's at sea. This is outlined in the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea. Every state shall effectively exercise its jurisdiction and control in administrative, technical, and social matters over ships flying its flag. While obviously there isn't exactly a court case history to back this up, the general consensus is that the same basic idea will hold true for ships in space, and certain agreements to date concerning spaceships do seem to bear that out, as well as help give us a partial framework for judges to work with. For example, in the Outer Space Treaty, beyond more or less attempting to ensure space stays free from any claim of national sovereignty, most pertinent to the topic at hand, it notes, state party to the treaty on whose registry an object launched into space is carried shall retain jurisdiction and control over such object and over any personnel thereof while in outer space or on a celestial body. More or less mirroring this idea on the International Space Station, the partnered nations came up with the Intergovernmental Agreement on Space Station Cooperation, which states in part the nations may exercise criminal jurisdiction over personnel in or on any flight element who are their respective nationals. As Joanne Gabrinovitz, the editor of Journal of Space Law, which is totally a thing by the way, elaborates, the law of the nation that contributed and registered the module applies to that module. Further, each astronaut is governed by the law of the nation they represent. Therefore, which nation's criminal jurisdiction will apply depends on which nation's module the alleged crime was committed and which nation the alleged perpetrator is from. It's also noteworthy that this space station agreement has already anticipated countless other things that may happen in space and how various nations can work together amicably to resolve them, leading many space lawyers, which are also totally a thing, to speculate that elements of this agreement are likely to get adopted into a more general, universal agreement at some point down the line. And in the meantime, judges may well lean on it among other existing agreements and analogous cases here on Earth when attempting to decide legal matters as they begin happening outside of the ISS. Speaking of these analogous cases, much like when a person travels to another nation and commits a crime, there are plenty of existing agreements and fodder for authorities to draw from when crimes are committed in space. While there certainly will be the occasional dispute, as even happens between nations on Earth over such matters today, there is a pretty good outline already in place as to how it will probably be sorted out. On top of this, even should you renounce your citizenship and be aboard your own vessel that likewise has no ties to any nation, perhaps even with you declaring said ship a nation of its own, it's likely that if you did anything serious, especially against someone who does still have citizenship with some nation, you would still face prosecution for any crimes, perhaps via an international criminal court or even a special tribunal. Although in this case, we're hoping such a court will be given the new, much cooler moniker of Galactic Criminal Court at some point. As the director of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University, Henry Hertzfeld, states, Although there is no sovereignty outside a spacecraft, there are analogies to the law on ships in international waters and also to issues that might occur in Antarctica, both places with no national sovereignty. So, although this is not a settled issue, my reading is that being in space and technically outside of any nation's sovereignty or jurisdiction is not sufficient to avoid being charged with a crime. Of course, even then there is still a lot of potential for grey area. For example, one of the world's leading space lawyers, Joanne Gabrinovitz, outlines one such scenario for people on the International Space Station, which has a pretty well-defined set of rules as previously noted. Each of the modules is registered by a different country, so that means that if you're in the US laboratory, you're on a piece of US territory. If you mosey over to the Japanese module, you're now in Japan. So it's like an embassy. It's national territory. What happens if it's been a long, hard day at the American lab and a European astronaut punches a Canadian in the American module but then runs over to the Japanese module, who has jurisdiction over that? But of course, that is just a jurisdictional issue. If a serious enough crime was committed, the person is going to get prosecuted somewhere. It just might be a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare in some cases to sort out where. When moving over to scenarios like actual colonization of places like Mars, once a colony is set up, it will no doubt enact its own laws, which those living there will have to agree to, whether explicitly or implicitly, not too dissimilar to moving to a new country here on Earth. And likewise, it is probable that extradition agreements and the like will be set up little differently from agreements between nations on Earth. Coming back around to the question of if there has ever yet been a crime committed in space, this allegedly occurred during astronaut Anna McClain's 6-month stint on the ISS in 2019. During that span, she supposedly accessed her recently ex-wife's bank account several times, allegedly to double-check if there was enough money in the accounts to cover bills and to care for the pair's son. On the other hand, her ex-summer warden took the matter more seriously, viewing it as illegal access to her accounts, thus potentially subjecting McClain to certain identity theft laws. Because McClain is an American citizen who was aboard the American module of the International Space Station when she allegedly committed the crime, was using one of NASA's computers at the time, and her supposed victim is likewise American, she was very clearly under the jurisdiction of the United States. However, as far as we can find, nothing ever came of these accusations other than a NASA investigation and a whole lot of news reports. McClain is still an astronaut for NASA, and otherwise no further updates on the matter have ever been made public, so presumably either it was decided no crime was actually committed, or the former couple settled the matter amicably and the investigation was dropped. But to sum up, no matter where you are in the universe, you can be fairly sure that judges the world over will be happy to cite similar type scenarios that have happened on Earth and existing agreements in making sure that you are prosecuted for crimes, assuming said crimes were serious enough to be worth the effort involved, or someone kicks up enough of a stink about it. And while there still is plenty of grey area, as soon as space tourism becomes a relatively common thing and people start committing crimes in space, it seems unlikely the various nations of the world will quickly develop a very comprehensive and definitive set of rules to govern such things when the need arises. All of that said, there are an awful lot of ways a seemingly innocuous sequence of events can lead to someone's death in space. Accidents happen. A faulty valve isn't necessarily proof that someone murdered someone else, even if they loathed each other. In some such ways, someone could die in space. Any halfway decent lawyer could instill reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors, especially if hard evidence couldn't be attained. After all, the expense of investigating such a crime thoroughly may well be enormous in some cases, thus making it so such a detailed investigation may not be done or is even possible. So let's just say, in many cases, it's going to be a lot more difficult to tell if there was someone behind such an event or if it was just an accident. Leading us to perhaps one of the cooler new jobs that are going to become a thing in the coming decades: space detectives. And let's get into today's bonus fact. Have you ever wondered what the longest prison sentence ever given out is? Well, want to know more? It was a whopping 141,078 years. It was given in 1989 in Thailand to Chumoy Thapyaso and each of her 7 accomplices for defrauding more than 16,000 Chinese investors as part of a massive Ponzi scheme. If you're wondering, in the United States, the longest sentence for some form of corporate fraud was only 845 years. This was handed down in 2000 to Sholem Weiss for his role in the collapse of National Heritage Life Insurance. By contrast, Bernie Madoff was only given 150 years for his 2009 conviction of defrauding thousands in a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. The second and third longest prison sentences for any crime globally were given to Zamal Zugam, 42,924 years, and Emilio Suarez Tras-Horas, 49,922 years, for their roles in the 2004 train bombings in Madrid. As for the longest prison term overall in the United States, it was given in 1994 to Charles Shot Robinson, who was convicted of 6 counts of rape, garnering him more than 5,000 years in prison, each a whopping 30,000-year sentence. Also in Oklahoma, Darren B. Anderson and Alan W. McLaurin each had in the thousands of years ranges of prison time imposed for the kidnapping, robbery, and rape of an elderly woman. Anderson was initially only sentenced to 2,200 years, but upon his second trial, he appealed and won a new one. That second jury imposed a sentence of 11,250 years. McLaurin was initially sentenced to 21,250 years, but the appellate court reduced it to a mere 500. The longest prison sentence imposed in Australia was given to Martin Bryant in 1996 for the Port Arthur, Tasmania massacre, where he killed 35 people and injured 23 others. His sentence included 1,035 years without parole, plus 35 life sentences, one for each life that he took.